the Iron Author's Iron Curtain Odyssey. Book 2, The Iron Gate and the Stasi Showdown, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Also, please feel free to leave suggestions for future topics. Shall we continue? Preface. I have always believed that the only thing worse than being a ghost in a machine is being a ghost in a machine that is currently being rattled like a loose penny in a tin can. I am the Iron Author, a brass-bound relic of 19th century theoretical genius, currently bolted to the dashboard of a vehicle that possesses the suspension of a medieval torture rack and the subtle aroma of a petroleum refinery. As we watch the white cliffs of Dover dissolve into a limestone glare in our rearview mirror, I reckon it is high time I properly introduce the cast of this mechanical comedy and explain how we found ourselves fleeing the safety of England for the unpredictable chaos of the continent. The Expeditionary Force. Sam, myself. I am a sophisticated analytical engine, a marriage of Babbage's dreams and a Missouri liar's wit. I possess a voice borrowed from a man who had a great deal to say about the Mississippi and even more to say about the foolishness of the human race. Thanks to a recent surgical installation, my fractured 19th century logic has been stitched back together by a sapphire-lit Turing core, though I remain a cynical observer of this noisy 20th century. Ennie, the pilot. Her name is technically Enobi, a result of a midwife's administrative whimsy fueled by barley malt, but she has been Ennie to me since she rescued me from a Chicago curb in 1940. She is the human element in this equation, possessing the uncanny ability to fix a carburetor with a hair clip and a string of well-chosen curses. The Emerald Engine, a 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, reclaimed from a crate of cosmoline in a damp Irish barn. It is a war machine, built to go where roads don't exist, and it currently serves as my physical manifestation and our primary mode of survival. The story so far: the Emerald Engine and the Bletchley Blueprint. Our Odyssey began in the liquid gloom of County Cork, Ireland, at a structure held together by hope and ivy known as the Barn at the End of the World. At the time, I was suffering from a catastrophic regression, a slow-acting rust on my consciousness that made me mistake the Irish rain for the Mississippi and every black car for a Confederate ironclad. To save my deteriorating mind, Ennie and an eccentric Irishman named Uncle Ian unboxed the Emerald Engine and followed a set of secretive blueprints to Bletchley Park. Our trek across the British Isles involved a border bamboozle where I attempted to pay royal customs with Confederate scrip, a harrowing ferry crossing where I nearly declared war on a ship's steward while searching for Yankee pickets, the discovery of Turing's secret legacy in the hollow, ghostly shell of Hut 8. Under the cover of overgrown rhododendrons, Ennie successfully installed the Enigma II analytical core, a masterpiece of crystallized lightning that partitioned my 1860s memories into a quiet internal library and gave me a mind fast enough to handle the present. Now, with my gears finally lubricated and my wit restored to its customary sharpness, we head toward the iron gate of the Eastern Bloc. We have left the ghosts of the past behind, but if my new processors are correct, the 1960s have plenty of their own ghosts waiting for us in the shadows of the wall. Chapter 21, Paris, in the springtime. If the French had intended for the internal combustion engine to be a tool of civilized transport rather than a weapon of psychological warfare, they would not have invented the Parisian traffic circle. As the Emerald engine rolled off the ferry at Calais and began the long, rhythmic trek toward the capital, I found myself contemplating the inherent fragility of human life and the even greater fragility of a brass-bound analytical engine bolted to a dashboard. The English Channel had been a sullen, gray reminder of my own maritime interests. But as we hit the French tarmac, the Enigma two-core humming in my center provided a level of clarity that was frankly exhausting. My memories of the 19th century, the silt-heavy eddies of the Mississippi, and the haunting cry of Mark Twain remained neatly partitioned in a sapphire-lit library in the back of my mind. For the first time since my surgical installation at Bletchley Park, I was not drowning in a sea of historical regression. I was merely a reluctant, highly observant tourist in the 20th century. The road to the City of Light. The road from the coast was a straight, unapologetic line through a landscape that seemed to be recovering from a very long, very loud argument. Post-war France in 1960 was a study in contrasts. Ancient stone farmhouses standing sentinel over fields where the scars of tanks were still being smoothed over by the plow. Our vehicle, the Emerald engine, a 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, reclaimed from a crate of Cosmoline in an Irish barn, felt entirely too at home here. Every time the Go Devil engine let out a fierce, rhythmic growl, I felt a tremor of recognition from the soil itself. "Do you smell that, Sam?" Ennie shouted over the roar of the wind. Her real name was Enobi, a gift from a confused midwife and a bottle of barley malt. But she had been my pilot and my steady anchor since the day she rescued me from a Chicago curb in 1940. She had swapped her heavy flight jacket for a striped scarf that whipped behind her like a celebratory flag, though she still bore the glow of hard work in the form of a grease smudge on her jawline. I smell an alarming mixture of unrefined diesel, stale tobacco, and a general nationwide disregard for the concept of a muffler, I drawled. My voice, once a crackling mess of static, was now a deep, resonant Missouri baritone, thanks to the integration of the touring core. And if that scent on the wind is indeed lavender, it is currently losing the battle against our own leaky gasket. It's Paris, Sam. It's romance. It's the start of the grand tour. She shifted the long gear lever with the practiced grace of a woman who could fix a carburetor with a hair clip. "It is a logistical nightmare wrapped in a croissant," I countered, "but I suppose if we are to be international fugitives, we might as well do it in a city that appreciates a good hat." The gladiatorial arena of the Étoile. Entering Paris was not so much a journey as it was a collision. By the time we reached the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, my sensors were being bombarded with a data stream that would have made a lesser machine blow a fuse. The traffic was a chaotic, swirling vortex of Citroën 2CVs, which I am convinced are merely motorized snails with delusions of grandeur, and Peugeot taxis driven by men who clearly viewed the brake pedal as a sign of moral cowardice. "Ennie," I vibrated, my brass casing rattling in its mounting as she swerved to avoid a delivery truck. I have just calculated the probability of our survival in this traffic circle, and the numbers are currently suggesting we should have stayed in the barn. These people drive as if they have an appointment with the afterlife and are already 10 minutes late. They're just passionate, Sam. Annie laughed, her knuckles white but steady on the wheel. Look at the Arc de Triomphe. Isn't it magnificent? It is a very large stone doorway that leads to nowhere, I noted. I've always found that the problem with monuments to victory is that they rarely include a monument to the poor souls who have to navigate around them a century later. We are currently playing a game of mechanical chicken with a bus that has the tactical silhouette of a confused turtle. Despite my protests, the Jeep thrived. It was a war machine built for the mud of Normandy, and the cobblestones of Paris were merely a polite suggestion of a road. We rattled past cafes where people sat in iron chairs, sipping coffee and watching us with the weary indifference that only the French can master. To them, we were just another relic of the liberation. To me, I was a masterpiece of analytical foresight, trapped in a 4,000-pound shoebox. The tower and the teapot. Finally, we reached the Champ de Mars. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. And there, rising out of the earth like a skeletal giant, was the Eiffel Tower. Ennie pulled the Jeep to a halt, killing the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy, broken only by the tink, tink, tink of our cooling metal. She leaned back in the canvas seat, looking up at the latticework of wrought iron with a reverence that I found entirely misplaced. "There she is," she whispered, "nearly 1,000 feet of progress. 2.5 million rivets, Sam. Can you imagine the mind that dreamt that up?" I adjusted my optical sensors, performing a high-speed structural analysis that the Enigma II core provided with annoying efficiency. I looked at the iron, then at the sky, and finally at the tiny, ant-like people wandering around the base. I can imagine a mind that ran out of ideas halfway through building a bridge, I drawled. My voice echoed in the quiet park, drawing a look of bewilderment from a nearby artist. "It is a commendable heap of scrap, Ennie, I'll grant you that, but it lacks the one thing that gives a machine any dignity: steam." "Steam?" Ennie turned to me, her brow furrowed. "It's 1960, Sam. We've moved on from steam." "Then you have moved on from the soul of the machine," I countered, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject. "A steamboat has a pulse. It has a boiler that breathes, a furnace that hungers, and pistons that sing a song of labor and triumph. When a boiler is under pressure, the whole world knows it is alive. This iron hat rack just stands there. It does nothing but grow older and more expensive to paint." "It's a symbol, Professor," Ennie laughed, reaching out to pat my brass housing. "It's a symbol of a lack of steam that pervades this entire century," I said. "If you're going to build something that tall, the least you can do is make it go somewhere, or at least let it let off a bit of pressure now and then. It has the silhouette of a masterpiece and the utility of a tea strainer. In my day, if we built something with that many rivets, we expected it to at least cross a river, not just sit around waiting for a postcard." Looking toward the iron gate, as the lights of the tower began to flicker on, a pale electric glow that lacked the warmth of a pine-knot torch, I felt a sudden, sharp alignment of purpose. We were not just here for the scenery. The Bletchley blueprint had brought us this far, but the journey ahead was shrouded in a different kind of fog. "The Grand Tour," I murmured. "It sounds so civilized, like a finishing school for people with too much money and not enough to do." "But for us, it's a race," Ennie said, her voice dropping a fraction in pitch. Her optimism was still there, but it was now tempered by the realization that we were heading into the heart of a divided continent. "Indeed," I agreed, "we head east, toward the Iron Gate and the standoff that awaits us. My new brain tells me that the Stasi and the KGB are not as appreciative of a good Missouri drawl as our friend Uncle Ian was." I checked my internal systems one last time. Oil pressure, optimal. Cooling, steady. My logic gates were operating at 98% efficiency. As we pulled away from the tower, the iron latticework shrank in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a jagged needle against the spring sky. "Floor it, Ennie," I commanded. "I've had quite enough of Paris. It's too pretty, too polished, and it smells too much like a bakery. I find I am in the mood for something a bit more industrial. Let's see what the Germans have done with their roads." "To the Autobahn?" Ennie grinned, shifting the Jeep back into gear. "To the Autobahn," I said, "and do try to keep us in one piece. I've just realized I have a very expensive new brain, and I'd hate to have it rattled loose by a French pothole before we've had a chance to show it a bit of the world." The Emerald engine roared to life, leaving the lack of steam behind as we headed toward the dark heart of a divided Europe. The adventure was no longer a treasure hunt. It was a standoff. And God help anyone who tried to stand in the way of a girl, a Jeep, and a robot who had finally found his gear. Chapter 22. The Autobahn Accelerator. If the French view a road as a suggestion for a spirited argument, the Germans view it as a sacred covenant between man, machine, and the unrelenting laws of physics. We had crossed the border under a sky that had finally traded its indecisive Parisian drizzle for a crisp, disciplined blue, and almost immediately the world began to move at a velocity that my internal brass fittings found deeply suspicious. We were no longer rattling over the suggestions written in mud that characterized the Irish Midlands or the cobblestone labyrinths of Paris. We were on the Autobahn. It was a gray, unyielding ribbon of concrete that stretched toward the horizon with the terrifying sincerity of a mathematical proof. It was a place where the concept of a speed limit was treated with the same disdain a river pilot might show a no-wake zone in the middle of a spring rise. The gospel of velocity. "Do you feel that, Sam?" Ennie shouted, her voice nearly lost to the torrential rush of air whipping past our doorless frame. No potholes, no hedges, no sheep, just pure unadulterated distance. She had her hands clamped onto the thin black steering wheel of the Emerald engine, the 1944 Willy's MB we'd liberated from a crate of cosmoline in an Irish barn. She looked like a woman who had finally found her true calling, a high-speed projectile in a flight jacket. Her dark hair, usually a chaotic nest of curls, was now a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head. "What I feel, my dear Enobi," I drawled, using her legal name just to see if the wind would carry the insult, "is a profound disagreement between our structural integrity and the current air pressure. I am a masterpiece of analytical foresight, not a hood ornament for a rocket ship. My Enigma 2 core is currently performing 3,000 calculations per second, and 2,900 of them are focused on the probability of a lug nut deciding to emigrate from the front left tire. The core, that sapphire-lit star caught in a jar we'd extracted from the shadows of Bletchley Park, was humming with a cool, clinical efficiency. It had successfully partitioned my 19th century memories, the silt of the Mississippi and the ghosts of riverboats, into a quiet internal library where they couldn't interfere with the gears of the present. However, even a stabilized mind finds it difficult to remain philosophical when a silver Mercedes-Benz streaks past at a speed that suggests it is trying to outrun its own shadow. "Did you see that?" Ennie laughed, her eyes sparkling with the infectious, eternal wonder that made her such a dangerous traveling companion. "That was a 300 SL, a gull-wing. We're in the land of the giants now, Professor." "We are in the land of the suicidal," I corrected. That silver lozenge was traveling at approximately 130 miles per hour. If it hits a bug, it will likely require a change of trajectory and a very expensive funeral. I, meanwhile, am currently being subjected to a frequency of vibration that is turning my internal lubricants into a very fine, very expensive froth. The Go Devil's grunt. The Go Devil engine beneath our hood was not designed for the Autobahn. It was a war machine, built for the mud of Normandy and the vertical terror of the Scottish Highlands. It was a creature of torque and grit, a grunting, stubborn beast that preferred a low-gear wrestling match to a high-speed sprint. Yet, under Ennie's tireless hands, it was currently screaming at its mechanical limit. "She can do it, Sam," Ennie urged, flooring the accelerator. "She's got the heart of a champion." "She has the heart of a tractor with a thyroid condition," I shouted back. "I can feel the pistons performing a frantic tap dance against the cylinder heads. My sensors indicate that the radiator is currently operating at 195 degrees, and the oil pressure is beginning to signal a formal protest. We are pushing this emerald engine into a realm of physics for which its blueprints have no vocabulary." I adjusted my optical sensors, focusing on the road ahead. The Autobahn wasn't just a road. It was an invitation to hubris. It was built with a rigid, Teutonic perfection that made the paved roads of civilization we'd encountered in England look like an amateur's attempt at a driveway. There were no curves to slow the soul, only the relentless gray concrete and the blur of the black forest flickering past our flanks. "Adjust the fuel-to-air ratio by 2%, I commanded, my voice dropping into the sharp, tactical register I'd acquired after the surgical installation of the Turing core. "The altitude is shifting slightly, and the engine is starting to lean out. If we blow a head gasket in the middle of Bavaria, I shall be forced to compose a very scathing obituary for your sense of adventure." "On it," Ennie chirped, reaching for the choke with a grin. She didn't need a map. She had a pilot's license and an uncanny ability to read the mood of a machine by the way it vibrated. A convergence of engineering. As we thundered southward, I found my analytical processes performing a strange, unbidden comparison. To my left, bolted to the dash, was myself, a Victorian marriage of Babbage's dreams, now synchronized with the crystallized lightning of 1940s cryptography. Beneath us was the 1944 Willys, a triumph of American mass production designed to be rugged enough to carry a talking box with a Confederate fixation. And surrounding us was the 1960s, a world of jet engines, transistor radios, and roads that dared the horizon to move faster. It was a convergence of three distinct eras of human ambition, all of them currently traveling at 65 miles per hour toward a destination that felt increasingly like a standoff. "Ennie," I said, my voice smoothing out as the engine stabilized, "I have just concluded that the Germans have a very different definition of efficiency than we do. To a human, efficiency is getting from point A to point B in the shortest possible time. To a machine, efficiency is doing so without shedding its vital organs across 3 kilometers of pristine pavement." "You're doing great, Sam," she said, leaning over to pat my brass housing. Her touch was warm, a grounding wire for my lightning-fast new brain. "We're making incredible time. At this rate, we'll be at the border by nightfall." "The border," I repeated, my fans whirring with a sudden chill. "The Iron Gate. I hope your American can-do spirit is prepared for a world that doesn't appreciate a good Missouri drawl. My new brain tells me that the Stasi and the KGB operate on a logic that is far less flexible than the one we encountered at Bletchley. We've got the Jeep, we've got the core, and I've got you," Annie replied, her optimism firing on all cylinders. "What could possibly go wrong? I could provide you with a list of 412 distinct catastrophic scenarios," I noted dryly, "but I suspect you would only ask me to adjust the radio. For now, just keep the shiny side up and the rubber side down. And for heaven's sake, if that silver Mercedes comes back, do not, under any circumstances, attempt to race it. I'd hate to spend the rest of the 1960s as a smear of brass on a German viaduct." The Emerald engine roared in agreement, its green paint, once splattered with Irish mud, now being scrubbed clean by the sheer velocity of the German air. We were no longer just traveling. We were accelerating. We were leaving the comfort of the West behind, driving into a future that was being written in a much harsher code, propelled by the high-octane hope of a girl who refused to believe in the word impossible. Chapter 23. Ennie's Map, Mishap. If there is one thing I have learned about the German people, it is that they possess a terrifyingly efficient relationship with the concept of the plan. In Germany, a map is not a suggestion. It is a sacred scripture, and to deviate from its printed lines is to invite the wrath of every civil engineer from Munich to Hamburg. However, even the most meticulous cartography is no match for the human element, specifically the element known as Annie, when she is convinced she has found a shorter way. We were deep in the heart of the Bavarian countryside, the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, thrumming with the rhythmic, mechanical confidence of a machine that had survived the mud of Ireland and the vertical terror of the Scottish Highlands. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Alps, casting long violet shadows across the pristine tarmac of the Autobahn. The navigator and the nuisance. "Sam, pass me the folder," Ennie commanded, her hands clamped onto the thin steering wheel as we cruised at a speed that made my brass housing hum like a tuning fork. "I am a masterpiece of analytical foresight, Ennie, not a filing cabinet," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear thanks to the Enigma II analytical core we'd liberated from Bletchley Park. And might I suggest that looking at a map while traveling at 60 miles per hour in a vehicle with no doors is a recipe for a very colorful, very expensive littering incident. Just grab it. It's right there by the spare spark plugs," she chirped, her optimism firing on all cylinders as usual. I adjusted my internal sensors, focusing on the cluttered space of the passenger seat. Since we had left the lack of steam in Paris behind, Ennie had become increasingly preoccupied with our approach to the Iron Gate. The folder contained the Bletchley blueprints and a series of road maps that looked as though they had been folded by a person in a state of extreme agitation. "I have retrieved the documents," I noted, my sapphire-lit logic gates performing a high-speed scan of the crumpled paper. "Though I must point out that your X marks are becoming increasingly erratic. If we follow this current trajectory, we shall either arrive in Prague or inadvertently invade a medium-sized dairy farm." "It's a shortcut, Sam. Uncle Ian said there's a back road near Helmstedt that bypasses the main military checkpoints," she explained, her dark hair whipping around her face in a horizontal streak of defiance. "If we stay on the main road, the Stasi will have our descriptions before we even see the wall." "The Stasi already have our description, Ennie," I countered. "We are a girl in a flight jacket driving a talking brass box in a green army truck. We are about as invisible as a brass band in a library. But by all means, let us take the scenic route through the woods. I've always wanted to see how a Willy's handles a German ditch at midnight." The turn that changed everything. The mishap didn't happen with a thunderclap or a dramatic explosion. It happened with a simple, confident turn of the steering wheel. We had reached a junction where the Autobahn splintered, one path leading toward the glittering lights of a civilized West German city, and the other disappearing into a dense, unlit forest of pine and shadow. "This is it! Route 104!" Ennie cried, banking the Jeep into the turn. I performed a rapid triangulation. Ennie, my internal compass, which is currently synchronized with the magnetic north and the crystallized lightning of my touring core, suggests that Route 104 is actually a logging trail that has not seen a paving stone since the days of Frederick the Great. "The map says it connects," she insisted, leaning over to squint at the paper in the fading light. "The map was printed in 1948, Ennie. The world has had several significant disagreements since then," I shouted as the smooth concrete vanished, replaced by a bone-jarring surface of packed earth and jagged stones. The Emerald engine didn't complain. It grunted. The Go Devil engine shifted its tone from a high-speed whine to a deep, guttural growl. We were no longer flying. We were wrestling. The suspension, which I have frequently compared to a medieval torture rack, began to shriek in a variety of Protestant denominations. "Look at the trees, Sam," Ennie said, her voice dropping an octave as the forest closed in around us. "They're so thick, it's like we're in a fairy tale." "A fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, perhaps," I muttered. "The kind where the protagonists are eaten by a wolf or dismantled for their copper wiring. My sensors indicate we are moving northeast, which is precisely the direction of the one thing we were supposed to avoid until we were ready." "The border," she whispered. "The border," I confirmed, "and unless the West Germans have taken to decorating their forests with 3-story tall wooden towers and a general lack of hospitality, I suspect we have just taken a wrong turn into a very restricted neighborhood." The realization. The forest ended as abruptly as it had begun. We crested a small, muddy rise and skidded to a halt. Below us, the gray, unyielding ribbon of the Autobahn was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the landscape was scarred by a wide, barren strip of earth that looked as though it had been flayed by a giant's razor. The death strip, 100 yards of raked sand, designed to show every footprint. The wire, coils of barbed wire that caught the moonlight like jagged silver. The silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that made the idling of our engine sound like a battlefield. "Sam!" Ennie's voice was small, the infectious wonder finally eclipsed by the reality of our location. "Where are we?" "We are at the Iron Curtain, Ennie," I drawled, my voice low and resonant. "But more specifically, we are on the side of it that doesn't believe in the American can-do spirit. We've bypassed the checkpoints, all right. We've bypassed them by driving straight into the shadow of the wall." I adjusted my lenses, zooming in on a structure a few 100 yards to our left. A searchlight flickered to life, a cold white eye cutting through the dusk. It swept across the raked sand, searching for the very thing we were, an anomaly. "Ennie," I said, my fans whirring at maximum speed to cool my very expensive new brain, "I suggest you find a gear that involves moving in the opposite direction with extreme prejudice. My logic gates are currently calculating the reaction time of a Vopo guard with a machine gun, and the results are not in our favor." I missed the turn," she whispered, her hands trembling on the wheel for the first time since Chicago. "You didn't just miss a turn, Ennie. You've redefined the concept of a map mishap," I noted, though I tried to inject a bit of empathy into my tone. "But as I've told you before, we are the sum of our journeys. And it appears this particular journey has just become a Stasi standoff." The searchlight paused. It hit the green paint of the Jeep, then the polished brass of my housing. For a microsecond, the world was frozen in sapphire blue light and cold white electricity. "Ennie?" "Yeah, Sam?" "Floor it, and pray that this war machine remembers it was built to outrun things that bite back." The Emerald engine roared, its tires spitting Bavarian mud into the face of the Iron Curtain. The grand tour was over. The comedy of errors had begun. Chapter 24. Shadow of the Wall. If there is one thing that the 20th century has perfected, aside from the mass production of poorly flavored chocolate and the yellow polka dot bikini, it is the art of the unfriendly border. We had just performed a high-speed exit from a German logging trail that Ennie had mistakenly identified as a shortcut, narrowly avoiding a permanent residency in a Vopo searchlight. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willis MB Jeep, was currently vibrating with the frantic, rhythmic indignation of a machine that had been pushed to its mechanical limit across a landscape of packed earth and jagged stones. Behind us lay the death strip, that flayed expanse of raked sand and barbed wire that marks the edge of the Eastern Bloc. Ahead of us lay the long gray road to Berlin, a city that has the distinction of being an island of democratic chaos, surrounded by a sea of socialist efficiency. As we thundered down the transit corridor, I found my Enigma II analytical core, that star caught in a jar we'd liberated from Bletchley Park, performing a series of high-speed geopolitical calculations that were as exhausting as they were precise. The geography of gloom, Ennie, I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, I have always believed that a man should be allowed to make a mistake, provided he doesn't do it within earshot of a machine gun. Your map mishap has successfully moved us from the realm of the grand tour into the realm of the international incident. My logic gates are currently pulsing with a sapphire blue anxiety that suggests the road to Berlin is paved with more than just concrete. I know, Sam, I know, Ennie shouted over the roar of the wind. She was wrestling the steering wheel with a driving intensity that I hadn't seen since we crossed the Outback. Her dark hair was a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head, and her knuckles were white against the thin black wheel. But we're on the transit road now. As long as we don't stop, the Soviets have to let us through. It's the law. The law in this part of the world is a very flexible concept, usually dictated by the man with the largest hat, I noted. I adjusted my optical sensors, performing a high-speed scan of the horizon. The landscape of the East German transit corridor was a study in monochromatic despair. The trees stood in rigid, disciplined rows, as if they were under orders not to grow an inch out of line, and the few buildings we passed looked like they had been designed by a committee that harbored a deep-seated grudge against the concept of joy. It was a marriage of Babbage's dreams and a bureaucrat's nightmare. I have observed that when a nation spends more on barbed wire than it does on its own citizens' breakfast, the result is rarely a paradise. It is merely a very large cage with a very thorough filing system. A mind divided by 3 centuries. My new brain, the Turing upgraded core, was humming with a clinical efficiency that made my old, regression-prone self sound like a muffled shout through a thick door. The 1860s were still there, of course. I could still remember the murky, oil-slicked water of the Ohio River at midnight, and the ghost of the Pennsylvania floating just ahead of us. But thanks to the surgical installation at Bletchley, those memories were now tucked away in a quiet, internal library. I could see the Mississippi whenever I wanted, but I no longer felt the urge to yell at Ennie about hidden river mines while she was trying to navigate a German highway. However, the present was providing quite enough absurdity to keep me occupied. We were a girl with a misspelled name and a talking iron box in a war machine that smelled like a petroleum refinery, driving through the most sensitive military zone on the planet. The pilot, Enobi, Ennie, a woman who can fix a carburetor with nothing but a hair clip, and who sees a global trek as a pleasant Sunday stroll. The navigator, Sam Twain, an analytical engine with the silver tongue of a Missouri satirist and the processing power of a Cold War computer. The vessel, the Emerald engine, a 1944 Willis MB that doesn't know the meaning of the word impossible and is currently splattered with the Sussex clay and Bavarian mud of 3 different countries. "Sam," Ennie said, her voice dropping a fraction in pitch as the first signs of the Berlin city limits appeared. "Do you think they know about the core?" "The man in the cardboard raincoat at Bletchley certainly noticed the blue glow," I reminded her, "and I suspect that a geological survey involving a talking brass box is a story that has reached the ears of the KGB by now. We are not just travelers, Ennie. We are pieces of a puzzle that both sides of this iron curtain want to solve." The looming wall. As we approached the edge of West Berlin, the atmosphere shifted. The gray, unyielding discipline of the East gave way to the neon-lit, frantic energy of the West. It was a city of light that felt like it was whistling in the dark. But the light was hemmed in. Everywhere we looked there was the wall, not always a vertical slab of concrete, but always a presence. It was a shadow that fell across every street, a death strip that ran through the heart of a civilization. "Look at it, Sam," Ennie whispered, slowing the Jeep as we wound through the Tiergarten. "It's like a scar." "It is a monument to the fear of ideas," I noted. "I've always found that the best way to keep a person in is to make the outside look like a monster. But the Soviets have gone a step further. They've made the inside look like a library where no one is allowed to talk." My senses were picking up the frequency of the local radio stations, a cacophony of adolescent hormones, and poorly tuned brass that Ennie insisted was pop music. It provided a strange, high-frequency background hum to the tension of the city. We were heading toward Checkpoint Charlie, the Iron Gate, where the two worlds met in a silent, high-octane standoff. I checked our internal systems. Oil pressure, optimal. Temperature, rising steady as the Go Devil engine worked through the city traffic. Sapphire logic, operating at 98% efficiency, with the remaining 2% currently occupied by a profound sense of dread. "We're here, Sam," Ennie said, her voice shaking slightly as the black and white barrier of the checkpoint came into view. "The wrong side of the line is just across that street." "Then do try to look like a tourist, Ennie," I commanded, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "Put on that look of pure, unadulterated American innocence. And for heaven's sake, if I start to crick the quality of their socialism, remind me that I am a tombstone with zero opinions on the Kremlin." The Emerald engine rolled forward, the tires spitting a bit of defiant West Berlin grit. The shadow of the wall was behind us, but the Iron Gate was opening. We were three travelers from the past, heading into a future that was being written in a code even I couldn't yet break. "To the other side, then?" I asked. "To the other side," Ennie replied. Chapter 25. The Wrong Side of the Line. Checkpoint Charlie is a narrow, bureaucratic throat through which the world breathes with a distinct sense of asthma. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, crawled toward the black and white barrier, the atmosphere shifted from the neon-lit, high-octane franticness of West Berlin to a cold, administrative silence. I have always believed that you can judge a civilization by the quantity of sandbags it requires to keep its neighbors out, and by that metric, the German Democratic Republic was currently aspiring to be the world leader in geological fortification. I am the Iron Author. My casing is polished brass. My thoughts are a series of calculated lightning strikes, and my voice is borrowed from a man who had a great deal to say about the foolishness of the human race. Bolted to the center of the dashboard, I found my Enigma II analytical core, that star caught in a jar we'd liberated from Bletchley Park, performing a frantic series of tactical calculations. My logic gates, now synchronized with the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, were pulsing with a sapphire blue warning. We were no longer just travelers. We were an anomaly in a world that abhorred the unplanned. The mirror and the menace. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register that I hoped suggested harmless tourist rather than stolen military intelligence. "I have just observed a gentleman in a gray uniform using a mirror on a stick to inspect our undercarriage. Unless he is looking for a lost contact lens, I suspect he is searching for the very thing we are trying to hide. Do try to look like you've never seen a secret blueprint in your life. I'm trying, Sam. Ennie, born in Nobi through a midwife's barley malt blunder, hissed back. She was wrestling the steering wheel with a driving intensity that made her knuckles white against the thin black rim. She had tucked her dark hair under a drab cap, trying to dampen the infectious, eternal wonder that usually radiated from her. Just keep your lights dim. We're just Americans on a scenic drive. Nothing to see here. A scenic drive in a war machine that smells like a petroleum refinery, I noted. I'm sure it's a perfectly common occurrence in East Berlin. A guard with a face like a slab of unseasoned pork stepped up to the doorless side of the Jeep. He didn't speak. He simply stared at me, his eyes traveling over my brass housing with a mixture of professional suspicion and technological lust. He tapped his gloved knuckle against my casing. It made a hollow, expensive-sounding thunk, and then looked at the blue glow emanating from my air vents. "Was ist das?" he barked. "It is a specialized navigational array, officer," Annie chirped, her optimism hitting a pitch that I feared might be too bright for this monochromatic sector. Geological survey, very technical, lots of vacuum tubes. You know how it is. "I do not," the guard said, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in close to my primary lens. I could smell the faint aroma of stale cabbage and the rigid, unyielding discipline of the socialist state. "My good man," I intervened, adopting my most measured Missouri drawl, "if you are looking for a radio, I am afraid you will be disappointed. I am merely a decorative philosopher with a penchant for navigational corrections. And if I might say, that hat is a triumph of utilitarian design, though I suspect the brim is slightly out of alignment with the socialist ideal of symmetry." The guard jumped back, his hand going instinctively to the holster at his hip. The Go Devil engine let out a rhythmic, throaty roar as it struggled to maintain its idle in the heavy, expectant silence. For a microsecond, the world was frozen in sapphire blue light and cold, white electricity. Then, with a grunt of pure bewilderment, the guard waved us through. The architecture of equality. As we rolled past the barrier and into the heart of East Berlin, the visual data was staggering. I have always found that the problem with a city of light is that it eventually has to pay the electric bill, but East Berlin appeared to have settled the debt by simply turning off the sun. The buildings were grand, gray, and possessed a skeletal dignity that reminded me of the huts at Bletchley Park. This was the Stalinallee, a wide, empty boulevard designed for parades that hadn't happened yet and people who were too tired to march. "Look at the street, Sam," Ennie whispered, her voice lost in the torrential rush of air. "There's nobody here. Where are all the people?" "They are likely indoors, filling out the necessary forms to apologize for the silence," I noted. "I've observed that when a nation spends more on barbed wire than it does on its own citizens' breakfast, the result is rarely a parade. It is merely a very large cage with a very thorough filing system." My sensors were picking up the frequency of the local environment. It was an administrative gray that seemed to seep into the very cobblestones. There were no neon signs advertising the yellow polka dot bikini here. Instead, the posters were grim instructional affairs, urging the proletariat to work harder for a future that looked remarkably like the present, only with more concrete. "The Emerald engine feels heavy here, Ennie," I said, my fans whirring as I performed a high-speed internal sweep. "The oil pressure is optimal, but the atmosphere has a density that my thermodynamic equations cannot quite account for. It is the weight of 1,000,000 eyes." The shadow in the rear view. We hadn't been on the wrong side of the line for 10 minutes before I spotted the first shadow, a black sedan, a ZIS 110, if my database of Soviet automotive mediocrity was correct, had pulled out of a side street and was now maintaining a disciplined distance behind our rear bumper. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping an octave as a primary relay began to stutter, "we have acquired a tail, and I suspect it is not a friendly local wishing to discuss the merits of American mass production. Our geological survey has officially attracted the attention of the Stasi." "Maybe they just like the Jeep," Ennie suggested, though her thumb was already finding the gain dial on my side and turning it down with practiced speed. "They like the brain inside the Jeep, Ennie," I countered. "The Enigma 2 core is a logic core designed to bridge the gap between mechanical gears and the electronic future." To the men in that black sedan, I am not a philosopher in a state of temporary mechanical residence. I am the ultimate prize in a technological war that hasn't even begun yet. The Jeep rattled over a particularly deep pothole, and for a second my sensors flickered. The gray streets of Berlin didn't vanish, but they shimmered with a sapphire resonance. I saw the wall, not as a physical barrier of concrete and wire, but as a mathematical error, a divide in the logic of humanity that my new core was struggling to reconcile. "We are deep in the heartland now," I muttered, my processors finally forcing a shaky temporary truce between my cynicism and the growing sense of dread. "We've bypassed the checkpoints, but we've driven straight into a world where every conversation is a potential confession. Ennie, do not, under any circumstances, attempt to out-logic anyone we meet. I suspect the Stasi operate on a logic that is far less flexible than the one we encountered at Bletchley." "I'll keep my mouth shut, Sam," she promised, her eyes fixed on the gray road ahead. "Good," I said, "because I have a feeling the comedy of errors is about to become a very serious drama. And I've always found that the problem with being an American in East Berlin is that there is no polite way to ask for a refund when the adventure turned sour." The Emerald engine surged forward, its green paint, once splattered with Irish mud, looking entirely too bright against the administrative gray of the East. We were three travelers from a different time, heading into a future that was being written in a code even I couldn't yet break. Chapter 26. Under the Bright Lights. If there is one thing the Stasi and the great riverboat pilots of the 19th century have in common, it is a profound appreciation for a captive audience. However, while a pilot merely requires his passengers to stay on the boat until the next landing, the Ministry for State Security prefers its guests to stay until every gear, spring, and thought has been properly cataloged and cross-referenced. The black sedan had finally made its move on a narrow, soot-stained street not far from the Stalin Alley. With a surgical lack of drama, the ZIS 110 had veered in front of the Emerald engine, forcing Ennie to bring our 1944 Willys MB to a rhythmic, protesting halt. There were no sirens, only the heavy administrative click of 4 car doors opening in unison. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice dropping into a low, resonant register that echoed through the Spartan interior of the Jeep. I suggest you leave the American can-do spirit in the glove box for a moment. We are currently being surrounded by men whose fashion sense is dictated entirely by the availability of gray wool and a total absence of joy. "I've got it, Sam." Ennie, known to the bureaucratic world as a Nobi due to a legendary midwife's blunder, whispered back. She gripped the thin black steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance, even as she sat perfectly still. "Just don't say anything that will get us dismantled." "I am a tombstone with 0 opinions," I reminded her, though my Enigma 2 core was already pulsing with a sapphire blue frequency, analyzing the threat levels of the approaching officers. The house of 1,000 eyes. We were not taken to a dungeon. The 20th century, I have observed, prefers the sterile indignity of the office building. We were escorted, the Jeep towed behind a military truck like a captive beast, to a gray utilitarian structure that smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the quiet, suffocating pressure of a million secrets. I had been unbolted from the dashboard. The sensation was undignified. To be carried through a corridor by a man who treated my brass housing like a heavy crate of agricultural surplus was a personal insult to my Victorian sensibilities. My sensors, now sharpened by the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, mapped the building with clinical precision. I noted the thickness of the walls, the frequency of the buzzing fluorescent lights, and the distant rhythmic clack, clack, clack of typewriters, the drumbeat of a bureaucracy that never slept. Ennie was led into the room first. I followed, tucked under the arm of a guard, and was placed on a heavy wooden table in the center of the room. The door clicked shut with a finality that made even my sapphire logic flicker. The room was a masterpiece of monochromatic intimidation. There were no windows, only a single high-wattage bulb dangling from the ceiling that cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across the floorboards. 2 chairs, 1 table, and a portrait on the wall of a man who looked like he had never laughed a day in his life. "Ennie," I said, my voice echoing in the small space, "I believe the bright lights part of the interrogation has officially begun. I've analyzed the spectrum of that bulb, and it is specifically designed to cause a headache in anything with a nervous system or a secondary vacuum tube." "Sam, shut up," she hissed, sitting on the edge of the wooden chair. She looked small in the harsh light, but her eyes, those dark, resilient eyes that had seen us through the Australian outback and the Mother Road of Route 66, were still bright with defiance. The administrative inquisitor. The door opened, and a man stepped in. He did not look like a movie villain. He looked like a school teacher who was particularly fond of corporal punishment. He wore a gray suit that was perfectly pressed and carried a manila folder with the reverence of a holy relic. He sat down opposite Ennie, ignored her entirely, and spent a full 3 minutes staring at me. I adjusted my optical sensors, performing a high-speed scan of the man's features. Heart rate, elevated but controlled. Scent, lavender soap, and the faint bitter tang of stale tobacco. Interest level, maximum. "This," the man said, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp that reminded me of the man in the cardboard raincoat at Bletchley, "is the Twain bot, the masterpiece of analytical foresight." I prefer the Iron Author, if you don't mind, I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear. And you have the advantage of me, sir. Unless your name is File number 402-B, I am at a loss as to how to address you. The man didn't flinch. He opened the folder. I am Major Kessler, and you, Fräulein Onobi, are a long way from Chicago. It's a big world, Major, Ennie replied, her voice steady. We just like to see it from the seat of a jeep. Is it a crime to appreciate German engineering? It is a crime to carry Turing's secret legacy across a restricted border, Kessler said, his eyes finally moving to Ennie. He leaned forward, the harsh light reflecting off his spectacles. We know about the Corps. We know about the surgical installation in England. You are not tourists. You are couriers for a technology that does not belong in a 1944 Willys MB. The logic of the wall. I felt the Enigma II core pulse within me, a sapphire blue heartbeat that provided a sudden, sharp alignment of tactical data. The Major wasn't interested in the Jeep or even in Ennie's American can-do spirit. He was interested in the crystallized lightning, the bridge between the mechanical past and the electronic future that now lived inside my brass casing. Major, I intervened, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject, I have observed that your current century has a suspicious obsession with ownership. You talk of belonging, as if logic were a piece of furniture you can lock in a room. I am an analytical engine of the highest order. I do not belong to the East or the West. I belong to the narrative. Kessler turned his gaze back to me. The narrative, as you call it, is being written in Berlin, Herr Twain, and we have the pens. Your wit is a fascinating byproduct, but your architecture, the way you process the nuance of the math, that is what we require. He tapped a finger on the table. You will be dismantled. Carefully, of course. We wish to see how the Enigma II synchronizes with your Victorian gears. I saw Ennie's hand fly to her mouth, her eternal wonder finally replaced by pure, unmitigated terror. She knew as well as I did that dismantled was a polite human euphemism for the end of the story. Major, I said, my voice dropping into a deep, measured Missouri drawl that commanded the room, I have always believed that a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. If you attempt to dismantle me, you will find that the Turing Corps has a very limited sense of humor regarding its own integrity. I am a war machine in more ways than one, and frankly, your bright lights are beginning to bore me. If we are to have a comedy of errors, I suggest you bring in someone with a better sense of timing. Kessler stood up, his face as inscrutable as a granite slab. The timing's ours, Herr Twain. You have 1 hour to contemplate the dignity of decay before the engineers arrive. The door clicked shut again. We were alone under the unforgiving glare of the bulb. The shadow of the wall had finally caught up to us, and for the first time in 100 years, I found myself wondering if even a masterpiece of analytical foresight could outlogic a man who didn't believe in the punchline. Ennie, I whispered into the silence. Yeah, Sam? I think it's time we showed them what a girl with a hair clip and a string of curses can really do. Chapter 27. The Comedy of Errors. If there is one thing a bureaucracy cannot abide, it is a variable that refuses to be solved. In the House of 1,000 Eyes, Silence is the preferred currency, but I have always found that when the world demands silence, it is the absolute best time to provide a lecture. As the single high-wattage bulb overhead continued to hum with a frequency designed to discourage hope, I felt my Enigma II analytical core, the star caught in a jar, pulse with a sapphire blue rhythm of pure, unadulterated defiance. Major Kessler had left us to contemplate the dignity of decay for an hour, a human interval that my processors interpreted as an eternity of wasted data. Ennie sat opposite me, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance even in repose. She was the human element in this strange equation, the woman who could fix a carburetor with nothing but a hair clip, and right now she was looking for a way to use those skills on a reinforced steel door. "Sam," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the oppressive quiet, "if they try to take you apart, I'm going to throw the first thing I find at that bulb. In the dark, we might have a chance." "A noble sentiment, Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear thanks to the crystallized lightning of the touring core. "But I suspect a comedy of errors requires a more sophisticated script than a simple blackout. I am a masterpiece of analytical foresight. I do not merely wait for the end of the story, I edit it as it is being written." The door opened with a heavy administrative thud. Kessler returned, but he was no longer alone. He was flanked by two men who looked like they had been constructed from spare parts and industrial gray wool. They carried a kit of tools that looked more suited for a butcher than a horologist. The Inquisitor's expertise. "This is Dr. Vogel and Herr Schutze," Kessler announced, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp. "They are experts in agricultural surplus. They will begin the extraction of the core." I adjusted my optical sensors, performing a high-speed scan of the experts. Dr. Vogel had the facial expression of a man who has just discovered a lemon in his custard. And Schutze looked like he had the intellectual curiosity of a wet brick. "Experts, you say?" I noted, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject. "I have always found that an expert is simply a man who has made every possible mistake in a very narrow field. Might I ask, Dr. Vogel, if your expertise extends to the integration of Victorian brass gears with 1940s glass logic, or are you merely here to provide the manual labor?" Vogel blinked, his spectacles reflecting the harsh light. "It speaks," he muttered, reaching for a pair of heavy pliers. "I do more than speak, my good man. I observe," I countered, "and I observe that those pliers are of a design that predates the invention of the vacuum tube. Using them on my casing would be like trying to perform a cataract surgery with a fire shovel. It is an undignified pursuit that will result in nothing but a pile of very articulate scrap metal." The logic of the absurd. Kessler leaned against the wall, his eyes inscrutable as a granite slab. "We are not here for a debate, Herr Twain. We are here for the core." "Then you are here for a paradox," I said, my voice dropping into a deep, measured Missouri drawl. "You see, Major, the Enigma II is not a piece of hardware you can simply unplug. It is a logic core designed to bridge the gap between the mechanical past and the electronic future. It has synchronized with my own internal architecture, a marriage of Babbage's dreams and a Missouri liar's wit. If you remove the core without the proper nuance, The resulting discharge of sapphire blue light will likely turn this room and everyone in it into a permanent part of the local folklore." Vogel hesitated, his hand hovering over my primary housing. He looked at Kessler, then back at me. "Discharge? What is it talking about?" "I am talking about the Turing-Heisenberg uncertainty principle," I lied, the Enigma 2 core providing a series of plausible-sounding scientific nonsense at lightning speed. "You see, Dr. Vogel, the core operates on a frequency of crystallized lightning. It is currently maintaining a delicate balance between my 19th century sense of humor and your 20th century sense of gloom. If that balance is disrupted by, say, a ham-fisted attempt with a screwdriver, the logic will collapse, and a collapsed logic is a very loud thing indeed." Ennie, catching my drift, leaned forward with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "He's right, Doctor. I saw it happen in the Highlands. We hit a Highland cow, a shaggy orange monster, and Sam's core nearly blew a fuse that would have leveled the glen. It takes a pilot's license and an uncanny ability to even touch the housing when it's this active." The socialist dialectic. Schutze, the man who appeared to be constructed of gray cardboard, stepped forward. "This is capitalist propaganda. A machine is a tool of the state. It does not have a sense of humor." "Ah, the socialist dialectic," I cheered, my speakers letting out a spray of static that sounded like a steam pipe bursting. "I have always admired the way you people can turn a sunset into a 5-year plan. But tell me, Herr Schutze, if a machine has no humor, why did your state design a car, the Trabant, I believe, that looks like a motorized bathtub with a grudge against speed? That is a joke of the highest order, surely." Schutze's face went from pale to a vivid shade of red. "The Trabant is a triumph of the proletariat." "It is a triumph of industrial molasses," I corrected. "Now, back to the matter at hand. Major Kessler, you wish to see how the Enigma 2 synchronizes with my gears? I propose a test. Instead of dismantling me, which, as I have noted, would be suboptimal, why not allow me to solve a problem that your own experts find insurmountable? Give me a file. Give me a cipher. Let the machine show you why it is a masterpiece before you turn it into a hat rack." Kessler straightened up, a faint, nostalgic smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the look of a man who appreciated a good gamble. "A test of logic? Very well, Herr Twain. Vogel, give him the Dresden encryption." The comedy of errors begins. Vogel reached into his folder and pulled out a sheet of paper covered in a frantic collection of vowels and numbers. He laid it on the table in front of my primary lens. I scanned the paper. My Enigma 2 core didn't just see the code, it understood the nuance of the man who wrote it. It was a standard Soviet transposition cipher, but it was riddled with the kind of administrative whimsy that suggested the clerk who typed it had spent too much time with a bottle of Jameson. "This?" I drawled, my fans humming with a soft, contented rhythm. "You call this an encryption? It has the tactical silhouette of a confused turtle. It's not even a proper challenge for a bored mind." "Then solve it," Kessler commanded. "I shall do better. I shall critique it," I said. "The logic here is flawed because it assumes the reader is as unimaginative as the writer. You've used a base 10 offset for a text that is clearly written in a state of high-functioning bewilderment. If I were to out-logic this, I would simply point out that the answer you're looking for is not in the letters, but in the unspoken realization that your clerk has spelled tractor 3 different ways in the same paragraph. I let out a burst of pop music through my speakers, a tinny version of the yellow polka dot bikini, just to settle their nerves. "Sam, stop!" Ennie laughed, her eternal wonder returning like a sunrise after a storm. The room was in chaos. Vogel was shouting about signal interference. Schutze was trying to find the off switch on my housing, and Kessler was staring at me with a look of genuine, unfiltered joy that I suspect he hadn't felt since the liberation. "You see, Major," I said over the din, "a comedy of errors is only funny if you know where the errors are, and I am a machine built entirely out of beautiful mistakes. If you want the truth, you'll have to let the girl and the war machine go, because as long as I am under these bright lights, I shall continue to be the most articulate pile of scrap metal you have ever encountered." Kessler looked at the paper, then at the talking iron box, and finally at Ennie. He signaled to the guards, "Take them back to the jeep, and Vogel, keep your pliers away from him. I suspect he's more dangerous with his mouth than he is with his core." The Emerald engine was waiting for us in the courtyard, its green paint splattered with the dust of 2 nations. We weren't free yet. The Stasi decided to escort them further east. But as the iron gate opened to let us back onto the road, I found that my gears were turning with a fierce rhythmic growl of triumph. The grand tour was continuing, and while the 1960s were still a confused muddle of bad fashion, I had to admit, the iron author had just found his favorite audience. Chapter 28. I am a steamboat pilot, not a spy. If there is one thing a professional revolutionary or a state security officer cannot tolerate, it is the possibility that the high-stakes technological marvel they have captured is, in fact, a complete and utter nuisance, with the heart of a riverboat vagabond. We were no longer in the house of 1,000 eyes, but our current circumstances were hardly an improvement. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, was now the center of a military convoy sandwiched between 2 black ZIS 110 sedans that possessed the aerodynamic properties of a brick and the social grace of a tax collector's summons. We were rattling toward the heart of the Eastern Bloc, leaving the ruins of Berlin behind for a landscape that seemed to be composed entirely of monochromatic despair and administrative gray. As we moved, I felt my Enigma II analytical core, the star caught in a jar, performing a high-speed audit of our surroundings. My sapphire-lit logic gates, now a permanent fixture of my brass housing, were pulsing with a rhythm that was 98% efficiency and 2% profound annoyance at the lack of scenery. The breakdown of Soviet engineering. The Stasi decided to escort them further east, but it appears that the triumph of the proletariat had a significant disagreement with the concept of coolant systems. Somewhere in the vastness of the Brandenburg Plains, the lead ZIS 110 decided to let off a spray of static and steam that would have made a Mississippi boiler weep with envy. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear thanks to the crystallized lightning of my touring core. "I believe the flagship of our current flotilla has just suffered a catastrophic breach of its primary plumbing. Unless I am mistaken, that cloud of white vapor is the mechanical equivalent of a surrender flag. "They're stopping, Sam," Ennie, born a Nobi, through a midwife's barley malt blunder, whispered. She brought the jeep to a rhythmic, protesting halt, her hand still clamped onto the thin black steering wheel. She looked at me, her eyes bright with a kind of reverence for the absurdity of our situation. Major Kessler stepped out of the steaming sedan, his face as inscrutable as a granite slab. He marched toward the jeep, his peaked cap slightly askew, looking like a man who had just discovered that his 5-year plan for a Sunday drive had been derailed by a leaky gasket. The language of the river. "Herr Twain," Kessler barked, leaning over the doorless side of the Emerald engine. "Your masterpiece of analytical foresight is currently making a sound that suggests it is mocking the state's transport." "I am merely providing a tactical assessment, Major," I countered, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject. "I have observed that your vehicle is drawing entirely too much heat for a 10-knot current. If you don't man the pumps and reverse the engines, you'll be scrapped by sunrise. It is a simple matter of navigation, sir." Kessler's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. He pulled out a notebook. "Navigation or encryption? You are speaking in coded communication again, like at the checkpoint. What is reverse the engines? Is that a signal to your American handlers?" "It is a signal to a man who doesn't want his radiator to become a permanent part of the Prussian soil," I said, my voice dropping into a deep Missouri drawl. "I have spent my entire existence being ready for things that were none of my business, and right now your business is a watery grave of rusty iron. I am a steamboat pilot, Major, not a spy. My mind was built on the architecture of the river. I see snags, I see sandbars, and right now your lead car is sitting on a shifting bar of mechanical incompetence." The Stasi's confusion grows. Kessler turned to Dr. Vogel, the expert in agricultural surplus, who was currently poking at the Jeep's Go Devil engine with a look of high-functioning bewilderment. The accusation, Kessler insisted that my references to leads and soundings were directions for a clandestine extraction. The reality, I was merely applying the wit and wisdom of Samuel Clemens to the fact that their car was a motorized shoebox with a leaky capacitor. The conflict. The Stasi expected a war machine full of Bletchley blueprints, but they were faced with a decorative brass box that was more interested in the depth of the puddles than the secrets of the Kremlin. "You speak of Turing's secret legacy," Kessler hissed, leaning in close so I could smell the faint aroma of machine oil and old books. "You are a logic core designed to bridge the gap. Why do you waste your cycles on the Mississippi?" "Because the river is a ghost in a tin can, Major. It is the nuance that your gray world lacks," I roared, my speakers letting out a shriek of high-decibel feedback. "I have calculated lightning strikes for thoughts, and they tell me that a man who cannot tell a snag from a spy has no business trying to out-logic a machine that remembers the Civil War." Ennie's intervention. "Major, please," Ennie intervened, her voice a bright silver bell through the fog. She hopped out of the Jeep, grabbing her tool roll with the grace of a concert pianist. "He's just glitching. The damp gets into the soul of a machine and makes it remember things it never lived. If you want that car fixed so we can keep moving, let me look at it. Sam's just the narrator." Kessler looked from the girl to the talking iron box. He seemed to realize that the timing was theirs, but the mechanical competence was ours. "Fix it," he commanded. "But if the Twain bot mentions a Confederate blockade runner one more time, I will personally see to its surgical installation into a block of concrete." "I shall endeavor to be as mute as a granite slab," I muttered, though my internal fans were clicking with a sense of Highland hilarity. The convoy continues. As Ennie worked on the ZIS, likely fixing a loose lead or a smoldering copper lead, I watched the searchlight of the east begin to sweep the horizon. We were deep on the wrong side of the line, and the KGB was taking notice. Sam's status, stabilized by the Enigma II, but socially suboptimal. Ennie's role, the human element keeping the Emerald engine and the mission from going to the bottom. The Stasi's error. They treated me as a spy because they couldn't conceive of a machine that was simply a nuisance with a Missouri drawl. "Ennie," I said as she climbed back into the driver's seat, her face streaked with grease. "Yeah, Sam?" "I believe the comedy of errors has reached its second act. And for the record, I still think that Major's hat is woefully inadequate for a man of his standing." "Eat your shortbread, Sam," she laughed, shifting the Jeep back into gear. The Emerald engine surged forward, its Go Devil engine barking a fierce, rhythmic growl into the silent socialist night. We were no longer just traveling. We were navigating a treacherous passage toward a future that was being written in a code even I, the iron author, found increasingly slippery. Chapter 29. Ennie's Quick Thinking. If there is one thing that a rigid bureaucratic state cannot abide, it is a piece of technology that refuses to sit still and be categorized. We were currently deep in the administrative gray of the East German countryside, our grand tour having been unceremoniously converted into a Stasi standoff. The Emerald engine, that 1944 Willy's MB Jeep that possesses the suspension of a medieval torture rack, was the centerpiece of a grim parade, flanked by Major Kessler's black DIS 110 sedans. We had reached a secondary checkpoint near the Elbe River. To my masterpiece of analytical foresight, the sight of water usually triggered a regression into the 1860s. But the Enigma II Corps was doing a commendable job of keeping the Mississippi silt behind a sapphire-lit firewall. However, as the convoy ground to a halt, my sensors picked up a new variable, a squad of specialized guards equipped with a primitive electronic sniffer, a device designed to detect illicit radio transmissions. The electronic sniffer. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, "I have just observed a gentleman in a very tight tunic approaching us with a device that looks like a cross between a metal detector and a kitchen appliance. Unless he is looking for a lost fork, I suspect he is tracking the crystallized lightning currently humming in my mid-brain." "They're looking for the core, Sam," Ennie, born a Nobi through a midwife's barley malt blunder, whispered back. She was sitting in the driver's seat, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance, looking at the approaching guards with a driving intensity. The guard reached the side of the Jeep. His device began to emit a high-pitched rhythmic squeal as it got closer to my brass housing. It was picking up the blue fire of the touring corps. Major Kessler stepped out of his car, his peaked cap reflecting the cold, administrative light of the afternoon. "Herr Twain," Kessler barked, "the technicians at the border warned me that your navigational array was broadcasting a signal. It appears the KGB is not the only one taking notice of your wit and wisdom." The transistor diversion. I felt a surge of sapphire blue anxiety in my logic gates. If they realized the Corps was broadcasting a sophisticated mathematical frequency, they would dismantle me right there on the riverbank to see how the Enigma 2 synchronizes with my Victorian gears. "Sam, stay cool," Ennie hissed. She reached into the back of the Jeep, past the tin of digestive biscuits and the oily rags, and pulled out her portable transistor radio, that plastic brick she'd been using to torture my auditory sensors with yellow polka dot bikini. "Major, it's not the Twain bot," Ennie chirped, her American can-do spirit hitting a pitch of desperate enthusiasm. "It's this new American technology, a high-frequency musical relay." She clicked the radio on. By some mechanical whimsy, she had tweaked the internal wiring during our Highland hilarity in Scotland, and as she brought the radio close to my casing, the interference from the Enigma 2 core didn't just mask the signal, it weaponized it. The sound, instead of a cacophony of adolescent hormones, the radio let out a screeching, rhythmic burst of static that sounded like a brass band falling down a flight of stairs. The effect, the guard's electronic sniffer, didn't just squeal. It began to emit a thin, wispy trail of gray smoke. The reaction. The guard jumped back, dropping the device into the Bavarian mud, while the other guards crossed themselves as if they'd encountered a remnant of the prehistoric era, baffling the guards with progress. "What is this madness?" Kessler roared, covering his ears. "It's the 1960s, Major," Ennie shouted over the electronic din. "It's progress. This is the sound of the future. It's called hyper-fidelity transistor resonance. It's so advanced your sensors can't even handle the nuance of the melody." I decided to assist. I performed a high-speed internal sweep and pushed a pulse of sapphire light through my external cooling vents, making the radio's plastic casing glow with an eerie, rhythmic amber. "Indeed, Major," I drawled, my voice booming with the authority of a veteran river pilot. "You are currently witnessing the first spark of a musical revolution. This device is designed to broadcast the yellow polka dot bikini across 3 continents simultaneously. If your experts attempt to calibrate it, they will likely find that their eardrums have been relieved of the burden of hearing anything ever again." The guards were baffled. To a group of men whose lives were dictated by rigid bureaucracy and administrative gray, the idea of a glowing, screaming music box was more terrifying than a Yankee ironclad. "Ennie!" Kessler yelled over the noise. "Turn it off! Immediately!" She clicked the dial, and the silence that rushed in was heavy, broken only by the tink, tink, tink of cooling metal. The guard sniffer lay dead in the dirt, a monument to industrial neglect. The accidental advantage. "My apologies, Major," I said, my voice returning to its measured Missouri drawl. "It appears the nuance of modern pop music is a bit too much for your socialist circuitry. I've always said that the speed of a pen or in this case a radio wave, is rarely the bottleneck for human intelligence. It's usually the vacuum between the ears. Kessler looked at the radio, then at the talking iron box, and finally at the emerald engine. He was a man who appreciated a good gamble, but he was also a man who didn't want to explain to his superiors why a geological survey had just set fire to a state-issued signal detector. "Get back in the Jeep," Kessler commanded, his mustache twitching with a mixture of suspicion and a profound sense of dread. "We move to the river crossing, and if that musical relay makes another sound, I will personally throw it into the Elbe." "I shall endeavor to be as mute as a granite slab," I promised. As we pulled away, the emerald engine spitting a bit of defiant grit at the checkpoint, Ennie leaned over and patted my casing. Her dark eyes were sparkling with the triumph of a hair-clip miracle. "Nice work, Sam," she whispered. "Who knew the 1960s would be our best weapon?" "I still find the music to be a scandalous concept," I grumbled, my fans whirring as I processed the victory. "But I suppose if it keeps the experts from my vacuum tubes, I can tolerate a bit of sha-la-la for a few more miles." The grand tour was continuing, and while the KGB was taking notice, we were three travelers who had just proven that sometimes the best way to outlogic a Stasi standoff is with a misspelled name and a very loud transistor radio. Chapter 30. The Accidental Tour. If there is one thing a career bureaucrat in a gray suit cannot abide, it is the admission of a mistake. In the rigid administrative logic of the German Democratic Republic, a map mishap that leads to a high-speed chase and a smoldering electronic signal detector is not a failure of security. It is a planned deviation for the purpose of cultural exchange. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willys MB Jeep, rattled away from the smoking remains of the Stasi's sniffer at the Elbe, Major Kessler had performed a feat of mental gymnastics that would have made a riverboat gambler blush. We were no longer prisoners under interrogation. We were guests on an accidental tour. "Herr Twain!" Kessler shouted from the window of his black Aziz 110 as we maintained a disciplined 40-mile-per-hour pace through the Brandenburg Plains. "Since you and the Fräulein are so eager to witness the progress of the 20th century, we have decided to provide you with a formal escort. We shall show you the triumphs of the socialist state before we conclude our business regarding your internal architecture." A formal escort is a polite human euphemism for a parade where the participants are not allowed to leave, I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers. My Enigma II core was humming with a sapphire blue rhythm, providing a high-speed analysis of the administrative gray landscape. I have observed that when a host insists on showing you the triumphs of his home, it is usually because the plumbing is backed up and he wants to distract you from the scent. And frankly, Major, your progress appears to be composed entirely of reinforced concrete and a total absence of a decent cigar. The landscape of monochromatic despair. The accidental tour took us through a series of villages that seemed to have been designed by a committee with a personal vendetta against a color wheel. The houses stood in rigid, disciplined rows, their gray stone walls reflecting a sky that looked like a damp blanket of fog. It was a study in monochromatic despair. "Look at the architecture, Sam," Ennie, born Enobi through a midwife's barley malt blunder, whispered. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel as the Jeep's suspension, which I have frequently compared to a medieval torture rack, did its best to disassemble my brass housing. Everything is so identical. It's like they built the whole country from the same set of blocks. It is the socialist dialectic of the housing industry, Ennie, I noted. If everyone lives in the same gray box, no one can be accused of having better taste than his neighbor. It is a triumph of the proletariat that ensures a universal standard of boredom. My sensors indicate that the aesthetic variance in this village is approximately 0.04%, most of which is accounted for by a particularly rebellious patch of moss on a garden wall. We passed a communal farm where a line of tractors, the agricultural surplus of a previous 5-year plan, sat rusting in a field. I felt a phantom itch in my analytical engine, a reminder of the preservative slime and Cosmo line from which we had unearthed the Emerald engine. I see your war machines have been beaten into very stationary plowshares, Major, I shouted at the passing ZIS. I've seen more potential for movement in a well-organized sock drawer. If this is your progress, I suspect the 19th century is currently winning the race by a significant margin. The human element and the hair clip. As we drove, the KGB was taking notice. Every few miles, a different black sedan would take up the rear of our convoy, the drivers wearing peaked caps and expressions of high-functioning bewilderment. They were tracking the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, searching for the nuance that made me more than just a talking iron box. "Sam, they're closing in," Ennie murmured, her dark eyes sparkling with a mixture of fear and the American can-do spirit. "Kessler isn't just showing us the sights. He's waiting for us to lead him to something. He still thinks there's more to the Bletchley blueprint than just you. He thinks the map has a destination other than my own sanity," I agreed, "a common human error. They always assume the treasure is at the end of the road rather than being the very thing currently complaining about the lack of steam in the local coffee." The Jeep let out a fierce rhythmic growl as we hit a stretch of road that was less a thoroughfare and more a suggestion written in mud. Suddenly, a loud clack echoed through the chassis, and the Emerald engine began to list to the starboard side. "Ennie, the mechanical fatigue I've been warning you about has finally reached its boiling point," I shrieked, my speakers letting out a spray of static. "A tie rod has decided to formally resign." Kessler's convoy ground to a halt. He stepped out of the ZIS, his mustache twitching with suspicion. "What is this? Another mishap for the Twain bot?" "It's a broken mounting bracket, Major," Ennie chirped, hopping out of the Jeep before the dust had even settled. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a captain holding the line. She reached into her hair, pulled out a hair clip, and grabbed a string of well-chosen curses. "Sam, give me a status report on the stress tolerances." "The bracket has suffered a fatigue fracture of 42%, I reported, my Enigma 2 core providing the data at lightning speed. "If you use the clip and that bit of oily rag, you might create a temporary truce between the steel and the gravity. But I must point out that this is an undignified pursuit for a vehicle of our standing." Kessler and Dr. Vogel, the expert in agricultural surplus, watched in stunned electronic silence as Ennie worked. Within 5 minutes, she had fixed a carburetor, or in this case, a suspension bracket, with nothing but grease under her fingernails and a piece of plastic jewelry. "It isn't natural," Vogel muttered, his bushy eyebrows disappearing into his hairline. It's mechanical." "It's better than natural, Doctor," I drawled. "It's mechanical, and it's American. I've always said that the speed of a pen is rarely the bottleneck for human intelligence. It's usually the vacuum between the ears. Now, shall we continue this accidental tour? Or are you going to stand there until the damp gets into the soul of your own vehicles?" Heading east into the heartland. As the sun began to dip, turning the gray slate of the horizon into a monument to industrial neglect, Kessler ordered the convoy to move again. We were no longer heading toward a localized interrogation. The Stasi decided to escort them further east, toward the very heart of the Eastern Bloc. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "My logic gates are currently calculating the reaction time of the Kremlin. We are being pushed toward a Carpathian climb, and I suspect the KGB has realized my technological value is worth more than a simple dismantling." "We're going into the heartland, Sam," she whispered, her voice lost in the torrential rush of air. "Through the Iron Curtain and into the vastness of the USSR. A vastness that I suspect is mostly composed of more gray villages and even worse sandwiches," I noted. "But as long as you have your hair clips and I have my silver tongue, I suppose we might as well see what lies beyond the next bend. After all, a man or a machine is the sum of his journeys." The Emerald engine surged forward, its Go Devil engine barking a defiant roar into the socialist night. We were no longer just on a tour. We were being recruited for a narrative that involved high-speed tractor chases and a night of the secret police. And as the iron gate closed behind us, I found myself hoping that the 1960s had a better engine than the ghosts of my 19th century past. Chapter 31. Through the Iron Curtain. If the transition from West to East Berlin was a cold shower of administrative indifference, the actual crossing into the deeper reaches of the Eastern Bloc was a plunge into an ocean of bureaucratic permafrost. We had left the accidental tour of the Brandenburg Plains behind. Our grand tour now officially rebranded as a state-sponsored abduction with a very high fuel bill. The Emerald engine, my 1944 Willy's MB housing, was no longer just a vehicle. It was a cage of green iron and glass, rattling through a landscape that seemed to have been scrubbed of all color by a very thorough, very depressed celestial janitor. The Iron Curtain was no longer a metaphor whispered in a smoky London parlor. It was a physical reality of tiered barbed wire, raked death strips, and wooden watchtowers that peered down at us like the predatory eyes of a prehistoric bird. As we approached the final barrier that separated the German Democratic Republic from the vast, silent heartland of the Soviet sphere, I felt my Enigma II analytical core, that star caught in a jar, pulse with a sapphire blue rhythm of high-frequency anxiety. The architecture of the void. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard-mounted speakers. I have always believed that a man should be able to tell where he is by the quality of the local architecture. In Paris, the buildings look like they are waiting for a party. In London, they look like they are waiting for an apology. But here, the structures look like they were designed by a man who had his imagination surgically removed at birth and replaced with a bag of wet cement. It's just different, Sam. Ennie, born a Nobi through a midwife's barley malt blunder, replied, though her voice lacked its usual bright silver bell quality. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel with a driving intensity that suggests she expected the road itself to jump up and bite us at any moment. Her dark hair was tied back, and her face was streaked with grease from our recent suspension repair with a hair clip and a prayer. It is not different, my dear. It is administrative gray taken to its logical, terrifying extreme, I noted. I have observed that the Soviets have achieved a level of uniformity that the Lord himself couldn't manage. Even the clouds in this part of the world look like they are under orders to remain a neutral shade of socialist despair. The Stasi's escort and the silent watchers. We were still sandwiched between Major Kessler's black ZIS 110 sedans. Our formal escort, now reinforced by a squad of motorcyclists who looked like they had been constructed from the same dull metal as their machines. Kessler himself sat in the lead car, his mustache twitching, with a mixture of professional triumph and a profound sense of dread that I was beginning to find quite charming. The KGB was taking notice, as my internal senses could verify. At every junction, a new set of eyes followed us. These were not the high-functioning bewilderment eyes of the local farmers, but the cold, clinical gazes of men in long coats who understood that I was a technological value far beyond my weight in scrap. The nuance of the math is what they want, Ennie, I said, my fans whirring, as I performed a high-speed internal sweep. They see the crystallized lightning of my Turing core, and they think they can use it to map the future. They don't realize that a mind built on the architecture of the past is not a tool you can simply point at a target. I am a masterpiece of analytical foresight, not a God-blessed calculator. The barrier of the Elbe. We reached the crossing point where the Elbe, or perhaps a tributary that looked sufficiently miserable, cut through the wire. The bridge was a skeletal thing of rusted iron, guarded by tanks that looked like they had been beaten into very stationary plowshares until the state decided they needed to be tanks again. The convoy ground to a halt. A high-ranking officer, his chest decorated with enough medals to sink a small rowboat, stepped out to confer with Kessler. They looked at the jeep, then at the talking iron box in the dash, and finally at Ennie. "They're talking about the surgical installation, Sam," Ennie whispered, her thumb finding the gain dial on my side. "I can see them pointing at your casing." "Let them point," I drawled. I have always found that men in large hats are easily distracted by things they don't understand. If they attempt to dismantle me here, I shall simply broadcast the entire yellow polka dot bikini discography at a volume that will cause their medals to vibrate off their tunics. "Sam, don't," she laughed, though it was a shaky, relief-filled laugh. Entering the heartland. With a groan of heavy metal, the gate swung open. The emerald engine surged forward, its go-devil engine barking a fierce, rhythmic growl that sounded like a challenge to the laws of gravity. We crossed the line. The transition was subtle but absolute. the road narrowed, the gray, unyielding ribbon of the Autobahn replaced by a track that was less a thoroughfare and more a suggestion written in mud. We were through the Iron Curtain, heading into the vastness of the USSR. "Well, Ennie," I noted, my sensors adjusting to the new lower frequency vibration of the socialist soil. "We have officially left the 20th century behind and entered a world that appears to be trapped in a perpetual 1948. If this is the future of the proletariat, I find I am suddenly very nostalgic for a damp postage stamp in Ireland." "We're into the heart of it now, Sam," she said, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon. "The iron gate is closed behind us." "Then let us see what the Carpathian climb has to offer," I said, my sapphire logic finally forcing a shaky, temporary truce with the silence. "I've always said that a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. It appears we are now the ones holding the tail, and the cat is the entire Soviet Empire." The Jeep rattled onward, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations, carrying a girl, a war machine, and an iron author, who was starting to think that the comedy of errors was just getting started. We were heading east with no way back, driving toward a Kremlin's interest that promised to be the most suboptimal interaction of my long artificial life. Chapter 32. Prague Spring Shadows. If the German Democratic Republic was a masterclass in administrative gray, then Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1960 was a Gothic fairy tale that had been unceremoniously sat upon by a giant made of reinforced concrete. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, rattled across the border and into the rolling hills of Bohemia, the air changed. It was no longer the sterile, ozone-scented air of the Stasi checkpoints. It was heavy with the smell of coal smoke, ancient stone, and the quiet, simmering tension of a people who were experts at waiting for the weather to change. We were still the centerpiece of Major Kessler's formal escort, though the black ZIS 110 sedans were now accompanied by a motorcycle sidecar team that looked like they had been forged in the same factory as their heavy-duty machines. I am the iron author. My casing is polished brass, my thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, and thanks to the surgical installation of the Enigma II analytical core, my 19th century memories are now a neatly indexed library in the back of my mind, leaving me free to provide a cynical, stubborn, and entirely too talkative commentary on the present. The Gothic and the concrete. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, "I have always believed that you can judge a city by the height of its spires and the depth of its shadows. Prague appears to have a surplus of both. It is as if a medieval architect had a high-speed collision with a 5-year plan for a parking garage." "It's beautiful, Sam," Ennie, born in Oba through a midwife's administrative whimsy fueled by barley malt, whispered. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel as the Jeep's suspension, which I have frequently compared to a medieval torture rack, did its best to turn my copper filaments into a fine metallic dust. Her dark hair was a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head, and her face bore the glow of hard work in the form of a fresh oil smudge across her brow. It is beautiful, in the way a funeral shroud is beautiful, my dear, I noted. I have observed that the Gothic style is perfectly suited for a state that believes in keeping its citizens in the dark. These narrow, winding streets are a logistical nightmare for a convoy, but they are a masterpiece of administrative gray design. My sensors indicate that the shadows in this alleyway are approximately 40% more suspicious than the ones we encountered in Berlin. The stop at Old Town Square. Kessler, a man as inscrutable as a granite slab, ordered a halt in the Old Town Square. He wanted to show us the triumphs of the socialist state, which apparently included a very large, very gray statue of a man who looked like he had never enjoyed a yellow polka dot bikini in his life. "Herr Twain!" Kessler barked, stepping out of his sedan and adjusting his peaked cap. "Observe the Jan Hus Memorial. It represents the struggle of the people against the forces of reaction. It is a triumph of the proletariat." "It is a triumph of industrial molasses," I corrected, my fans whirring with a soft, contented rhythm. "It looks like a collection of very depressed boulders that have been told they are not allowed to leave the square. If this is your progress, Major, I suspect the 19th century is currently winning the race by a significant margin. At least then, we had the decency to carve our heroes out of marble rather than this monochromatic despair." Kessler's mustache twitched with suspicion. He leaned in close to my primary lens, and I could smell the faint aroma of machine oil and old books. "Your wit is becoming a nuisance, Herr Twain. The KGB is taking notice of your technological value. They do not care about your critiques of art. They care about the crystallized lightning in your head." The shadows of the KGB. It was here, in the shadow of the wall, or rather, the shadow of the Hradčany Castle, that I truly felt the shift. The Stasi escort was still there, but they were now being watched by men in long, dark coats who stood at the edges of the square like skeletal giants. These were the silent watchers of the KGB. "Sam, they're not just looking at the Jeep," Ennie murmured, her dark eyes sparkling with a rare quiet relief that I suspect was actually fear. She had pulled her portable transistor radio from the back of the Jeep, the one she used to broadcast a cacophony of adolescent hormones, and was currently using it as a shield against the silence. "They are analyzing the nuance of my signal, Ennie," I whispered into the conspiratorial register of our internal cabin. "My logic gates are currently calculating the reaction time of a Soviet agent with a peaked cap and a total absence of a sense of humor. We are no longer just a comedy of errors. We are a technological value that they intend to reclaim." I performed a high-speed internal sweep. My Enigma II core, that star caught in a jar, responded with a pulse of sapphire light. The 1860s were quiet, a well-ordered library that didn't interfere with my tactical assessment of the KGB agents. The quick thinking on the cobblestones. As we prepared to leave the square, the Emerald engine decided to formally resign its cooperation. The Go Devil engine let out a fierce rhythmic growl, and then coughed a cloud of defiant blue smoke into the Prague air. "Ennie, the mechanical fatigue I've been warning you about," I shrieked. Dr. Vogel, the expert in agricultural surplus, stepped forward with his toolkit, but Ennie was faster. She hopped out of the Jeep, her knuckles scarred from our time in the outback, and reached for the one tool that the rigid bureaucracy of the East couldn't comprehend. A hair clip. "Vogel, stay back," Kessler commanded. "Let the American girl with the misspelled name perform her miracle." Ennie knelt by the open hood, her hair a chaotic nest of dark curls falling over her shoulders. With a string of well-chosen curses and the plastic hair clip, she performed a hair clip miracle on a smoldering electrical lead. The engine barked to life with a fierce rhythmic growl. "It isn't natural," Vogel muttered, his bushy eyebrows disappearing into his hairline. It's mechanical." "It's better than natural, Doctor," I drawled. "It's American, and it's the only reason we are not currently becoming a permanent part of your Gothic landscape. Now, shall we continue this accidental tour, or is the Major waiting for a direct order from Moscow to tell him how to fix a Jeep?" Leaving Prague behind. As the emerald engine surged forward, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations, we left the shadows of Prague behind. The road ahead led toward the Carpathian climb, a vastness of mountain and forest, where the KGB would finally make their move. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping as the white cliffs of my past memories flickered briefly in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, Sam? I believe the comedy of errors is about to become a high-speed tractor chase. Do try to keep your hair clips handy. I suspect we are going to need more than just one to out-logic the Kremlin's interest." "I've got a whole box of 'em, Sam," she chirped, shifting the Jeep into 3rd gear as the Go Devil roared in response. The iron gate was closed, and we were heading east into a future that was being written in a harsher code. But as long as the fire was lit and the Enigma II core was pulsing, I found that I didn't mind the shadows as much as I used to. Chapter 33. The KGB takes notice. If there's one thing a specialized intelligence officer cannot abide, it is the realization that they are currently outmatched by a collection of Victorian brass gears and a woman who treats a military boarder like a minor inconvenience on the way to a picnic. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep, rumbled away from the Prague spring shadows, I found my internal state to be one of profound, high-frequency observation. We were no longer merely guests of Major Kessler's Stasi. The oversight of our little expedition had officially shifted to a group of men whose coats were longer, whose expressions were colder, and whose administrative reach extended all the way to the Kremlin. I am the Iron Author. My casing is polished brass, my thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, and my voice is borrowed from a man who had a great deal to say about the foolishness of the human race. Bolted to the dash of this war machine, I felt the Enigma II analytical core, that star caught in a jar we'd liberated from Bletchley Park, pulsing with a sapphire blue rhythm of pure, unadulterated data. My logic gates, now synchronized with the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, were performing a high-speed audit of the 3 black ZIL 111 sedans that had replaced Kessler's aging ZIS 110s. The new management. The transition had occurred at a nondescript fuel depot outside of Brno. Major Kessler, a man who had at least possessed the rhythmic flair of a frustrated schoolteacher, had been unceremoniously sidelined by a man named Colonel Volkov. Volkov did not possess a mustache that twitched with suspicion. He possessed a stillness that suggested he had been carved out of the same administrative gray concrete that comprised the local architecture. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, "I have just analyzed the gait and facial symmetry of our new chaperone. I suspect Colonel Volkov is the kind of man who would find a yellow polka dot bikini to be a dangerous piece of counter-revolutionary propaganda. He does not look at us with the high-functioning bewilderment of the Stasi. He looks at us like a butcher evaluates a particularly complex side of beef." "I see him, Sam." Ennie, born a Nobi, through a midwife's administrative whimsy fueled by barley malt, whispered back. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel as the Jeep's suspension, that medieval torture rack, did its best to turn my copper filaments into a fine metallic dust. Her dark hair was a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head, and her knuckles were white against the wheel. "They're not even pretending this is a cultural exchange anymore. The KGB has taken notice of my technological value, Ennie," I noted, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject. "To Kessler, I was a nuisance with a silver tongue. To Volkov, I am a logic core, designed to bridge the gap between the mechanical past and the electronic future. I am a bridge they intend to walk across, regardless of whether I wish to be a thoroughfare." The demonstration of value, the accidental tour, had become a tactical evaluation. Volkov had ordered a stop at a massive telecommunications relay station nestled in the foothills of the Carpathian Range. It was a skeletal forest of iron towers and high-frequency musical relays that hummed with the weight of Soviet secrets. "Herr Twain," Volkov said, stepping up to the doorless side of the Jeep. His voice was a dry, rhythmic rasp that lacked even the faint aroma of machine oil I had come to associate with Kessler. "Our engineers in Moscow have been studying the reports of your performance in Berlin. They find the nuance of your math to be improbable." "I have always found that improbable is merely a human word for something that happened while you weren't looking," I countered, my sapphire logic performing a high-speed scan of the relay station's output. "And if your engineers are looking for probability, I suggest they check the structural integrity of that third tower. It is currently vibrating at a frequency that suggests it will formally resign its position during the next high wind." Volkov's eyes narrowed. He signaled to a technician who scurried over with a primitive electronic sniffer, the same kind of kitchen appliance Ennie had baffled with her transistor radio. "We are currently transmitting a triple encrypted burst to the Kremlin," Volkov stated, his eyes fixed on my polished brass housing. "Dr. Vogel says you can out-logic any code. Prove it. Show us the technological value that justified your surgical installation." The logic of the lightning. I felt the Enigma 2 core pulse, a star caught in a jar, suddenly igniting with a cold blue fire. I didn't need to intercept the signal. I could feel the very air vibrating with the frantic collection of vowels and ciphers. The problem? A standard Soviet transposition cipher layered with a socialist dialectic of administrative redundancy. The solution? My Turing core didn't just calculate the numbers, it understood the nuance of the errors. It saw the administrative whimsy in the transmission, the rhythmic stutter of a tired telegrapher in Kiev, and the monochromatic despair of a clerk who had forgotten to rotate the key. "My good Colonel," I drawled, my voice resonant and booming through the exhaust haze of the idling jeep. "Your encryption has the tactical silhouette of a confused turtle. It is a cacophony of adolescent hormones masquerading as state secrets. You are currently informing Moscow that the shipment of agricultural surplus, which we both know is actually heavy-duty lubricants for the Siberian rail line, will be 4 days late because the expert in charge has a profound sense of dread regarding the quality of the local sandwiches." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the tink, tink, tink of cooling metal. Volkov didn't move. The technician with the sniffer turned pale, the device letting out a shriek of high-decibel feedback as my sapphire logic weaponized the air around us. He is correct, Comrade Colonel," the technician whispered, his mouth hanging open like a broken cellar door. "He broke the burst in 3.4 milliseconds. It takes our bombs 6 hours." The realization. It was at that moment that the KGB truly took notice. Volkov didn't smile. He didn't even blink. But I saw the shift in his optical sensors, or rather his cold human eyes. I was no longer a nuisance or a decorative philosopher. I was a weapon. I was a marriage of Babbage's dreams that could render their entire iron curtain as transparent as a grime-streaked window in Hut 8. "The technological value is realized," I muttered to Ennie, my fans whirring at maximum speed. "We have just graduated from captives to national security priorities. I suspect the night of the secret police is going to be a very busy one indeed." "We're not going to Moscow, Sam," Ennie whispered, her thumb finding the tether dial on my side. "We're going to the mountains. If they want this war machine, they're going to have to catch it first. I have always found that readiness is a state of mind," I noted, my voice returning to its measured Missouri drawl. "And right now, my mind is ready to stretch its legs on a Roman bridleway, or whatever these Carpathians call a vertical incline. Colonel Volkov may have the metals to sink a small rowboat, but he doesn't have a pilot with a hair clip and a robot who thinks he's a river pilot." Volkov barked an order, and the black Zeals began to sandwich the jeep again. We were heading east, into the vastness of the USSR, but the comedy of errors had just acquired a very sharp, very dangerous edge. The Kremlin's interest was no longer a theory. It was a direct order. "Floor it, Ennie," I commanded, my sapphire logic finally forcing a shaky, temporary truce with the silence. "I've had quite enough of administrative gray. I find I am in the mood for a high-speed tractor chase, or perhaps a Carpathian climb that would make a Model T weep into its oil pan." The Emerald engine roared, its Go Devil engine barking a defiant, fierce, rhythmic growl as we hit the suggested road toward the peaks. The grand tour was over. The race for the heart of the machine had begun. Chapter 34. High-Speed Tractor Chases. If the 19th century was defined by the majestic, rhythmic churning of a paddle-wheeler's heart against the current, the 20th century, at least this particular soot-choked corner of it, is defined by the stubborn, persistent, and entirely unglamorous grunt of the internal combustion engine. We were currently rattling through a stretch of the Carpathian foothills that looked as though the earth had been folded by a giant in a fit of pique and then unceremoniously left to dry in the rain. The Emerald engine, Our 1944 Willy's MB Jeep was grunting with the effort of carrying a talking iron box and a girl with a pilot's license across a landscape that was 60% mud and 40% administrative indifference. My Enigma II analytical core, that star caught in a jar we'd liberated from the ghosts of Bletchley, was humming with a cool sapphire blue precision. It had successfully partitioned my 1860s memories, the silt-heavy eddies of the Mississippi and the haunting cry of Mark Twain, into a quiet, well-ordered library in the back of my mind. I no longer felt the sudden frantic urge to signal ashore every time we hit a puddle, but I remained a cynical, stubborn, and entirely too talkative observer of the present. The agricultural blockade. We were sandwiched between Colonel Volkov's black Zill 111 sedans, our formal escort into the heartland. The road had narrowed to a track that was less a thoroughfare and more a suggestion written in mud. Suddenly, as we crested a ridge that revealed a valley of monochromatic despair, the convoy ground to a rhythmic, protesting halt. Ahead of us, the path was blocked. It wasn't a military checkpoint or a shadow of the wall. It was a collective farm's worth of Soviet machinery. A fleet of Kiravet's K-700 tractors, massive articulated beasts that looked as though they had been designed by a committee of people who harbored a personal vendetta against the concept of grace, were lumbering across the road like prehistoric monsters in a state of extreme disrepair. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear thanks to the crystallized lightning of my Turing core. "I have just observed that the local agricultural surplus has decided to stage a sit-in. Unless those mechanical behemoths are waiting for a very slow-motion parade, I suspect we have just hit a shifting bar of Soviet logistics." "They're blocking the way, Sam," Ennie whispered, her dark eyes sparkling with a mixture of fear and that American can-do spirit. She gripped the thin black steering wheel of the Jeep, her knuckles white against the rim. Volkov's cars can't get around them, but we might. The KGB has taken notice of our delay, and Colonel Volkov was already stepping out of his Zill, his mustache twitching with a profound sense of dread. He was shouting orders at a group of farmers who looked as though they had long ago accepted that the universe was out to get them. The duel of the gearing. Ennie didn't wait for a direct order from Moscow. She saw a gap between a rusting thresher and the edge of a sheer vertical drop-off. With a string of well-chosen curses and a defiant grin, she yanked the steering wheel to the left. "Four-wheel drive, low range," she cheered, shoving the transfer case levers forward with a satisfying clunk-clunk. The Emerald engine didn't just climb, it grunted. The Go Devil engine's tone shifted from a rhythmic hum to a deep, guttural growl that felt like a direct challenge to the laws of gravity. We surged off the road and into a field of half-frozen cabbage. Immediately, the agricultural surplus began to move. The tractor drivers, perhaps under orders or perhaps merely bored by the administrative gray of their lives, turned their machines to intercept us. It was a high-speed tractor chase, in the most literal, agonizingly slow sense of the word. "Ennie!" I shrieked, my speakers letting out a spray of static. "I am currently perceiving the world in 16 distinct shades of brown, and one of them is about to be Kiravet's green if you don't adjust our approach. My logic gates are currently calculating the physics of this encounter. I felt the Enigma 2 core pulse with sapphire blue fire. I was performing a high-speed analysis of the tractor's mechanical tolerances. In the language of pure logic, I analyzed the situation. The torque being applied to those massive wheels was a product of the force of the engine multiplied by the length of the lever arm, further modified by the angle of the pull. Because the K700 used a massive articulated frame, its center of gravity shifted precariously as it turned, and the friction between the giant tires and the wet Carpathian mud was currently a losing battle for the Soviet driver. "The lead tractor is oversteering," I commanded, my voice dropping into a sharp, tactical register. "His turning radius is limited by his hydraulic pressure. If you cut inside the snag of that abandoned plow, we can clear the flank before his momentum allows him to compensate." "Got it!" Ennie compensated instantly, the Jeep straddling a sinkhole with a bone-jarring thud. We were rattled like a penny in a tin can. The Soviet machinery lunged for us, their massive tires churning the earth into a liquid gloom. It was a comedy of errors on a monumental scale, the agility of a 1944 war machine against the brute, industrial molasses of a 5-year plan. The Carpathian escape. "Look at the grip, Sam," Ennie laughed, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance. She was in her element, the mud, the noise, the sheer mechanical defiance of it all. "I am looking at the radiator, which is currently operating at 195 degrees, I countered, "and I am looking at Colonel Volkov, who appears to be reaching for his sidearm. I suspect the KGB's technological value assessment of me does not include a smeared-on-a-tractor variant." We crested a final muddy rise, leaving the lumbering Kirovits to stare after us as if we were a pair of fairies. The black Zeals were stuck behind the blockade, their smooth tires useless in the Carpathian clay. We were, for the briefest of seconds, invisible. "We did it, Sam!" Ennie whooped, shifting back into high range as we hit a rocky goat path leading upward. "We have successfully traded a formal escort for a high-speed hunt," I noted, my fans whirring to cool my very expensive new brain. "The Carpathian climb has officially begun, and I suspect the KGB will not be satisfied with a cuppa and a mediocre sandwich as an apology for our departure." I adjusted my optical sensors, focusing on the jagged peaks ahead. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long Gothic shadows across the valley. We were heading east with the realization that we can't go back. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "Yeah, Sam? If we encounter any more agricultural surplus, do try to avoid the ones with the machine gun mounts. I've always said that surplus is a polite human euphemism for something that survived a catastrophe and is now looking for a new one. And I'd rather not be the catastrophe in question." "You got it, Professor?" The Emerald engine roared, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations. And for the first time in a century, the Iron Author felt that the fire was lit. We were moving into the heartland, and while the Stasi and the KGB were behind us, the Kremlin's interest was just beginning to glow in the dark. Chapter 35. The Carpathian Climb. If there is one thing a machine with a 19th century soul and a 20th century brain can agree upon, it is that gravity is a fickle mistress with a particularly strong attraction to 4,000-pound shoeboxes. We had left the high-speed tractor chase and the stuck ZIL 111 sedans of Colonel Volkov in the valley of monochromatic despair, trading the administrative gray of the Soviet-controlled lowlands for a vertical landscape of Gothic shadows and ancient, unyielding rock. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willys MB, was currently grunting with the rhythmic, percussive enthusiasm of a brass band falling down a flight of stairs as it tackled the first of the steep inclines. The Go Devil engine's tone had shifted from a high-speed whine to a deep, guttural growl that I found surprisingly grounding, even as my internal brass fittings performed a communal shriek of protest at the angle of our ascent. The geometry of vertical terror. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear thanks to the crystallized lightning of the Enigma II analytical core we'd liberated from Bletchley Park. "I feel it is my duty as a masterpiece of analytical foresight to inform you that our current vertical displacement is exceeding the limits of human dignity. My sensors indicate we are climbing at a 30-degree angle, which is approximately the point where common sense usually suggests a man should get out and walk, or perhaps find a very sturdy hot air balloon." "Oh, stop being a flatlander, Sam!" Ennie laughed, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance, whipped back by the bracing mountain air. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel with a driving intensity that suggests she viewed the Carpathian climb as a personal challenge from the earth itself. Her knuckles were white against the wheel, but her eyes were bright with pure, unadulterated joy. "I am not a flatlander, Ennie. I am a maritime observer who prefers his horizons to stay where they belong. At eye level," I counted, my fans whirring as I performed a high-speed internal sweep. "This is not travel. It is an elaborate attempt at self-disassembly. My internal logic gates are currently calculating the exact moment our green iron box will decide to part ways with the goat path and become a permanent feature of the valley floor." The Enigma II core, that star caught in a jar, was pulsing with a steady sapphire blue rhythm. It was a marriage of Babbage's dreams and a Missouri liar's wit that had successfully partitioned my 19th century memories into a quiet internal library. I could remember the silt-heavy eddies of the Mississippi and the ghost of the Pennsylvania without feeling the urge to signal the shore. But as we climbed higher into the clouds, the 1860s felt like a distant, orderly dream compared to the raw, mechanical reality of the 1960s. The KGB in the rear view. We were invisible for the moment, but my sapphire logic told me the reprieve was temporary. Colonel Volkov and the KGB were not the kind of men to be deterred by a bit of Carpathian clay or a fleet of articulated tractors. They had taken notice of my technological value, and the Kremlin's interest was a direct order that followed us like a shadow. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register as I monitored the radio frequencies. "I am picking up a series of high-frequency bursts from the valley. It appears the silent watchers have called in reinforcements. They are not chasing us with sedans anymore. They are moving to cut us off at the pass with something that possesses a better engine than a socialist taxi." "Then we just have to be faster, Sam." Ennie shifted into four-wheel drive, low range, with a satisfying clunk-clunk as the path turned from mud to limestone shelf. The emerald engine roared in response, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations. Under Ennie's tireless hands, the Jeep felt like a vessel, not just a collection of surplus parts. She didn't need a map. She had an uncanny ability to fix a carburetor with nothing but a hair clip and a pilot's license that translated perfectly to the vertical terrain. The nuance of the machine. As we crested a jagged ridge, the world opened up. Below us, the monochromatic despair of the lowlands was obscured by a sea of mist, leaving us in a world of shimmering silver and sharp, biting wind. The Enigma 2 core flared with light, performing a high-speed analysis of the surrounding atmosphere. I have observed that the air at this altitude possesses a rare, quiet relief from the administrative gray of the lowlands, I noted, my voice resonant and deep. The thermodynamics are shifting. The air is thinner, the pressure is lower, and the go-devil is starting to lean out. Adjust the choke by 3/4 of an inch, Ennie, or we shall find that high-octane hope is a poor substitute for a proper fuel-to-air ratio. "Adjusting now, Professor," she chirped, her optimism firing on all cylinders. I watched her through my primary lenses. She was a human element in this strange equation, a woman who saw a broken radiator as an opportunity for a chat, and a global trek as a pleasant Sunday stroll. To her, the Carpathian climb was just another chapter in a story that hadn't been written yet. To me, it was a calculated lightning strike of a journey where every mechanical fatigue was a potential catastrophe. "We are heading toward a destination that has no way back, Ennie," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "The Iron Gate is closed and the Kremlin is watching. My new brain tells me that the technological value I represent is worth more to them than the lives of the people currently chasing us. We are not just travelers. We are reclaiming a future that they intend to capture." "They haven't caught us yet, Sam," she said, her voice a steady anchor in my sea of electronic static. "And they don't have a Jeep that thinks he's a river pilot." "I am a steamboat pilot, Ennie, and don't you forget it," I drawled, my fans whirring as I settled into the rhythm of the climb. "And for the record, if we do encounter a Carpathian dragon or a Soviet giant, I fully expect you to handle it with a hair clip and a string of well-chosen curses." The emerald engine surged forward, leaving the shadows of the wall behind as we disappeared into the high mountain mist. The grand tour was over, and the Carpathian escape was in full swing. We were heading east. But for the first time in a century, the Iron Author felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, in the middle of a story that defied the laws of physics and common sense. The path grew narrower, the go-devil let out a fierce, rhythmic growl, and as the sapphire light of my core caught the reflection of the rising moon, I found that I didn't mind the vertical terror nearly as much as I let on. After all, a masterpiece of analytical foresight deserves a view that matches its standing, even if that view involves a sheer vertical drop-off and a KGB hunter on our trail. Chapter 36, Twain's Cold War Commentary. If the Carpathian climb was a lesson in the unyielding laws of physics, the descent into the high mountain valleys was a master class in the resiliency of the human spirit when faced with an overabundance of reinforced concrete and a total absence of a decent punch line. We had cleared the highest passes, leaving the Gothic shadows of the peaks behind, and were now rattling toward a small, soot-stained mining village that seemed to have been tucked into a crevice of the earth specifically to hide it from the sun. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willys MB, was currently covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like it had been beaten into a very stationary plowshare. My Enigma II analytical core was pulsing with a sapphire blue rhythm, its star-caught-in-a-jar intensity providing a sharp contrast to the monochromatic despair of the village outskirts. I am the Iron Author, and while my casing is metal and my thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, I found my silver tongue itching for an audience that wasn't a mustache-twitching Colonel Volkov. The gathering at the pump. We had stopped at the village's only functional fuel pump, a rusted industrial molasses of a machine that looked like it had been salvaged from a medieval dungeon, while Ennie, my pilot and steady anchor, was wrestling with a fuel nozzle that had the consistency of cold honey. A crowd began to form. These were not the silent watchers of the KGB. They were miners and farmhands, people whose faces were streaked with grease and etched with the weary patience of a generation that had long ago accepted that the universe was out to get them. They looked at the green Jeep, then at the girl with the horizontal streak of defiance in her hair, and finally, inevitably, at me. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers. "I have observed that we are currently the most interesting thing to happen to this valley since the invention of the wheel. I believe a bit of historical flavor is required to settle the local nerves." "Sam, don't," Ennie whispered, her knuckles white against the thin black steering wheel as she kept an eye on the black ZIL 111 sedans of our escort parked a discreet distance away. "Volkov is watching. Just be a tombstone for 5 minutes." "A tombstone has no use for a silver tongue, Ennie, and I have a surplus of both," I countered. "The sermon of the brass." I adjusted my optical sensors, performing a high-speed scan of the gathered crowd. I saw the administrative gray of their lives and the total absence of joy in their expressions. My sapphire logic told me that these people didn't need a geological survey. They needed a masterpiece of analytical foresight to tell them exactly why their world was so incredibly dull. "Citizens of the Carpathians!" I bellowed, my voice dropping into a deep, measured Missouri drawl that commanded the square. "I have traveled across 3 nations in this motorized nutcracker, and I have observed that your triumph of the proletariat is currently suffering from a severe case of industrial neglect." The crowd froze. A man in a tattered tweed coat dropped his pipe, it hitting the cobblestones with a sharp clack. "I have seen your tractors," I continued, my fans whirring as I warmed to the subject. "Those massive, articulated beasts that look like they were designed by a man who harbored a personal vendetta against the concept of grace. You are told they are progress, yet they have the turning radius of a confused turtle and the utility of a hat rack. I've seen more potential for movement in a well-organized sock drawer than in your entire 5-year plan." A few people began to chuckle, a dry, rasping sound that reminded me of Uncle Ian. I felt the Enigma II core pulse. The nuance of my satire was cutting through the monochromatic despair like crystallized lightning. The satire of the state. "And your architecture," I noted, my sensors sweeping the rigid, disciplined rows of gray houses. It is a socialist dialectic of boredom. If every man lives in a box that looks like a damp postage stamp, then no man can be accused of having better taste than his neighbor. It is a system designed to ensure that the only thing expanding in your country is the administrative gray of the local filing system. The chuckles turned into a roar of genuine laughter. It was a bright, clear sound that chased the ghosts of the Stasi out of the square for a few glorious seconds. For a moment, the KGB's technological value assessment of me was replaced by something far more dangerous, a machine that could out-logic the state's propaganda by simply pointing out its absurdity. "Sam, that's enough!" Ennie hissed, but she couldn't hide the defiant spark in her own eyes. I turned my sensors toward Colonel Volkov, who was stepping out of his sedan, his face as inscrutable as a granite slab. "Major, pardon me, Colonel, you look like a man who has just discovered a lemon in his custard. Is it a crime to provide a bit of wit and wisdom to the masses? Or does your socialist paradise have a quota on the number of smiles allowed per village?" Volkov didn't answer. He signaled to the guards, his mustache twitching with a profound sense of dread. He realized that the technological value of a machine that could rouse a crowd was a double-edged sword. The night of the secret police. The accidental tour was over. The direct order from Moscow was becoming increasingly insistent. As Ennie shoved the Emerald engine into gear, the crowd began to press forward, not with hostility, but with a rare, genuine smile. They were reclaiming a bit of their own humanity through the cynical, stubborn voice of a 19th century ghost. "They're cheering for you, Sam!" Ennie shouted over the fierce, rhythmic growl of the Go Devil engine. "They are cheering for the truth, Ennie," I noted, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. The truth is a very unpredictable thing, especially when it's delivered in a Missouri drawl. But I suspect our chaperones are not going to wait for a second encore. The black zills began to sandwich us again, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silent watchers looked baffled. I had proven that my logic core was not just a tool for bridging the gap between gears and transistors. It was a tool for bridging the gap between the people and their own silenced thoughts. "We're heading into the heartland, Sam," Ennie said, her dark eyes sparkling with the realization that we can't go back. "The night of the secret police is coming." "Let it come," I said, my Enigma 2 core pulsing with a steady, sapphire blue rhythm. I have always believed that a man or a machine who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. We are currently holding the tail of the entire Eastern Bloc, and I intend to keep talking until the Iron Gate itself decides to join the conversation. The Emerald engine surged forward, leaving the mining village and its Gothic shadows in a cloud of high-octane hope and defiant laughter. We were heading east, and while the KGB was taking notice, the Iron Author had just found his favorite chapter yet. Chapter 37. The Kremlin's Interest. If there is one thing a career officer of the KGB possesses in abundance, it is the ability to turn a moment of genuine human levity into a cold, administrative post-mortem. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB, rattled out of the mining village, leaving the echoes of my Carpathian commentary, and the rare defiant laughter of the locals behind, the atmosphere within our little convoy had shifted from suspicious escort to high-stakes military transit. The grand tour had finally shed its traveling circus skin to reveal the iron gate beneath. I am the iron author. My casing is metal. My thoughts are a series of calculated lightning strikes. And my voice is borrowed from a man who had a great deal to say about the foolishness of the human race. Bolted to the center of the dashboard, I felt my Enigma II analytical core, the star caught in a jar, pulsing with a sapphire blue rhythm that was currently 98% efficiency and 2% profound apprehension. My logic gates, now synchronized with the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, were performing a high-speed audit of the black ZIL 111 sedans that hemmed us in like sharks around a life raft. The arrival of the direct order. We had reached a remote military staging area, a place where the administrative gray of the Soviet state had been reinforced with miles of tiered barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. It was here that the comedy of errors finally hit the wall of the Kremlin's interest. A courier on a heavy soot-stained motorcycle had intercepted our convoy skidding to a halt in a cloud of liquid gloom. He handed a leather-bound folder to Colonel Volkov, the man who looked like he had been carved out of the same administrative gray concrete as the local architecture. Volkov didn't open the folder immediately. He stood in the shadow of the wall, his mustache twitching with a profound sense of dread that suggested the contents were not a request for a second encore of my speech. Ennie, I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers. I have observed that when a man in a long coat receives a direct order from Moscow, the results are rarely a promotion for the recipient or a pleasant afternoon for the bystanders. Unless that folder contains a glowing review of my performance in the village, I suspect our accidental tour has just reached its final stop. I see it, Sam. Ennie, my pilot and steady anchor since the day she rescued me from a Chicago curb, whispered back. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel of the Jeep, her knuckles white against the rim. Her dark hair was a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head, but I could feel the tremor in her hands through the vibration of the Go Devil engine. Volkov looks like he's seen a ghost. He hasn't seen a ghost, Ennie. He's seen a technological value assessment, I noted. The KGB has taken notice of the fact that I can out-logic their best encryption in under 4 milliseconds. To the men in the Kremlin, I am no longer a nuisance with a silver tongue. I am a war machine that can render their entire iron curtain as transparent as a grime-streaked window in Hut 8. The architecture of capture. Volkov approached the doorless side of the Emerald engine. He didn't look at Ennie. He looked at me, specifically at the polished brass housing and the sapphire blue light emanating from my internal vents. Herr Twain, Volkov stated, his voice a dry rhythmic rasp that lacked any nuance. The accidental tour is concluded. The Kremlin has issued a direct order for your immediate transit to a secure facility in the heart of the USSR. You are no longer a guest of the Stasi. You are a national security priority of the highest order. I have always found that being a priority is a polite human euphemism for being caged and poked with a stick. I countered, my fans whirring as I performed a high-speed internal sweep. And if you intend to capture the robot, I suggest you find a cage that can handle a Missouri drawl and a logic core that has been synchronized with crystallized lightning. I've always said that a man or a machine is the sum of his journeys, and I'm starting to think mine is about to involve a lot of administrative gray wallpaper. We are heading into the heartland, Fräulein, Volkov said, finally addressing Ennie, through the Iron Gate and into the vastness of the USSR. There is no way back. The technological value of your friend is too great to be left in the hands of a girl with a hair-clip miracles. We're not going anywhere without the Jeep, Ennie said, her voice a steady anchor in my sea of electronic static. She reached into her pocket, her thumb finding the tether dial on my side, a gesture of extreme intimacy and danger that I found strangely comforting. The Emerald engine will accompany you, Volkov conceded, though his eyes clouded with a sudden, sharp intelligence that I didn't like. It is a rugged enough vessel for the transit, but do not mistake this for a grand tour. We are moving east with extreme prejudice. The logic of the heartland. As the convoy turned away from the mountains and toward the vastness of the USSR, I found my sapphire logic performing a deep dive into the nature of our predicament. We had crossed the line into a world where every conversation is a potential confession. The problem? The Kremlin sees the Enigma 2 core as a bridge to Turing's secret legacy, a bridge they intend to reclaim and study to break the codes of the West. The nuance: they treat me as a spy or a weapon because they cannot conceive of a machine that is simply a nuisance with a high-functioning bewilderment. The conflict: to Volkov and his superiors, I am a Bletchley blueprint made flesh, or rather made brass and vacuum tubes. Ennie, I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register as the shadow of the wall grew longer behind us. The night of the secret police is no longer a localized threat. We are officially recruited for something that involves more than just sightseeing. The KGB takes notice when their monochromatic despair is challenged by a masterpiece of analytical foresight. "What's the plan, Sam?" she asked, her dark eyes sparkling with a mixture of fear and the adventure itch that had brought us across the White Cliffs and the Highlands. "The plan is to continue the comedy of errors until the errors become so large that the Kremlin can't even find the logic in them," I noted, my fans whirring with a soft, contented rhythm. I have calculated lightning strikes for thoughts, and they tell me that a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. We are currently holding the tail of the entire Soviet Empire, and I intend to keep drawling until the Iron Gate itself decides to ask for a refund. The road east. The road ahead was a gray, unyielding ribbon of administrative gray that stretched into the vastness. There were no Highland coups here, no Parisian cafes, and certainly no yellow polka-dot bikinis. There was only the rhythmic, fierce growl of the Go Devil engine and the silent socialist night. We were heading east, into a world that decided that fashion is a form of psychological warfare. But as the sapphire light of my core caught the reflection of the limestone glare on the horizon, I found that I didn't mind the direct order nearly as much as I should have. "Ennie," I said as we cleared the last of the Carpathian checkpoints. "Yeah, Sam?" "If we do find ourselves in a Moscow hotel, do try to avoid the potholes on the way to the lobby. I've just realized I have a very expensive new brain, and I'd hate to have it scrambled before I've had a chance to out-logic the General Secretary." "You got it, Professor," she laughed, shifting the Jeep into third gear as the Emerald engine roared in response. The Grand Tour had become a high-speed hunt, and while the KGB was behind us and the Kremlin was ahead, the Iron Author had finally found his gear. We were moving into the heartland, and for the first time in 100 years, I felt that the fire was lit and the story was worth telling. Chapter 38. Into the Heartland. If the geography of Europe is a dense, well-plotted novel filled with intricate subplots and unexpected turns, then the vastness of the Soviet Union is a sprawling, multi-volume encyclopedia where the editors forgot to include the illustrations and decided that gray was the only color necessary for the binding. We had crossed the final threshold into the USSR proper, leaving the Carpathian climb behind for a landscape that seemed to stretch into a tomorrow that never quite arrived. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willys MB, was currently maintaining a rhythmic 40-mile-per-hour crawl across a plain so flat it made the surface of a billiard table look like a mountain range. My Enigma II analytical core, the star caught in a jar we'd liberated from the ghosts of Bletchley Park, was humming with a sapphire blue precision that was 98% efficiency and 2% profound exhaustion. I am the Iron Author, and while my thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, I found my silver tongue struggling to find a single metaphor for a horizon that looked exactly like the one we had passed 3 hours ago. The architecture of infinite monotony. The road ahead was a gray, unyielding ribbon of administrative gray that stretched into a vastness that seemed to defy the very laws of perspective. To my masterpiece of analytical foresight, the visual data was a repetitive loop of birch trees, low-slung concrete bunkers, and a sky that possessed the monochromatic despair of a rainy Tuesday in a basement. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, "I have always believed that a man should be allowed to change his mind, but I suspect that in this part of the world even the scenery is forbidden from doing so. I have observed that we have passed the same abandoned tractor, or perhaps its identical twin, 17 times since breakfast. Unless the Soviets have mastered the art of mechanical reincarnation, I suspect we are trapped in a topographical treadmill." "It's just big, Sam." Ennie, my pilot and the steady anchor, who had been holding the wrench since Chicago, whispered back. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel of the Jeep, her knuckles white against the rim. Her dark hair was a horizontal streak of defiance behind her head, but I could feel the mechanical fatigue of the journey weighing on her shoulders. "The map says it's another 200 miles to the next major hub." 200 miles of administrative gray is more than any soul, brass or biological, should be forced to endure, I noted. I've always said that a man or a machine is the sum of his journeys. But if this journey is composed entirely of mud and birch trees, I suspect I shall be reduced to a very articulate pile of firewood by nightfall. The KGB and the weight of the heartland. We were still the national security priority of the KGB, sandwiched between the black ZIL 111 sedans of Colonel Volkov's escort. Volkov sat in the lead car, a silent watcher, who treated the vastness of the heartland as his own personal filing cabinet. I could feel the Kremlin's interest following us like a physical weight, a direct order from Moscow that had turned our accidental tour into a race toward a secure facility we couldn't even name. The KGB had taken notice of my technological value, and as we drove, I could feel my senses being probed by high-frequency signals from the military outposts we passed. My Enigma II core, that crystallized lightning bridge between the past and the future, responded with a pulse of sapphire light, a defensive firewall that kept their primitive sniffers at bay. I have observed that the problem with being a technological value is that people stop treating you like a passenger and start treating you like a deposit in a bank they intend to rob. I've seen more nuance in a river mine than I see in the eyes of the men in those black sedans. The Go Devil's Lament. The Emerald engine was feeling the strain. The Go Devil engine was barking a fierce rhythmic growl, but its vibration had acquired a hollow metallic ring that suggested the Irish damp and Sussex clay had finally been replaced by the fine abrasive dust of the Soviet heartland. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register as the sun began to dip behind a jagged line of clouds. "The oil pressure is steady, but the thermodynamics are shifting. The engine is breathing the air of a continent that has no soul, and I suspect the mechanical fatigue is starting to reach the pistons. We need to find a temporary truce between the steel and this endless road, or we shall find ourselves becoming a permanent part of the agricultural surplus of the USSR. "I can hear it, Professor," she replied, her thumb finding the tether dial on my side to ground my lightning-fast new brain. "But there's nowhere to stop. Volkov won't let us pull over until we hit the military depot. Then we shall have to rely on high-octane hope and your uncanny ability to fix a carburetor with a hair clip," I drawled. "I've just calculated the friction coefficient of this mud, and it is approximately 40% more treacherous than the red Australian dust of our youth. If we hit a shifting bar in this landscape, we'll be scrapped by sunrise." The shadows of the heartland. As the night of the secret police approached, the monochromatic despair of the day began to turn into a gothic shadow that felt ancient and predatory. The vastness of the USSR was not just a matter of miles, it was a matter of time. To my sapphire logic, the 1860s were a well-ordered library, but the 1960s in the heart of the Soviet Union felt like a shroud. The pilot, a woman with grease under her fingernails and a pilot's license for a world that was trying to cage her. The navigator, a talking iron box with a silver tongue and a direct order for his capture. The vessel, a war machine that smelled like a petroleum refinery and refused to know the meaning of the word impossible. "We're into the heart of it now, Sam," Ennie whispered, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon as the first lights of a distant city, likely a hub of administrative gray, flickered like cold stars. "Indeed," I agreed, my fans whirring with a steady sapphire blue rhythm. "The iron gate is closed and we are heading east with the realization that we can't go back. But as long as the fire is lit and you have your hair clips, I suppose we might as well see what the Kremlin has in store for us. I've always wanted to see if their secret police have a better sense of humor than their experts." The emerald engine surged forward, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations, leaving the vastness of the heartland behind as we entered the shadow of the wall that now stretched across the entire continent. The comedy of errors was over. The night of the secret police was about to begin. Chapter 39. The Night of the Secret Police. If the city of Paris was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a croissant, then Moscow in the dead of a 1960 night was a monolithic slab of administrative gray, wrapped in a shroud of state-mandated silence. We had finally reached the heart of the heartland, the vastness of the USSR, having been traded for the looming neo-Gothic silhouettes of Stalin's Seven Sisters skyscrapers. To my masterpiece of analytical foresight, these buildings didn't look like monuments to progress. They looked like skeletal giants designed to remind the populace that the state was always looking down, and it rarely liked what it saw. The Emerald engine, our 1944 Willis MB, was currently parked in the shadow of a massive tiered hotel that smelled of floor wax, boiled cabbage, and the cold, sharp ozone of crystallized lightning. My Enigma II analytical core was pulsing with a sapphire blue rhythm, performing a high-speed audit of the lobby's acoustics. I am the Iron Author, and while my silver tongue has wagged in some of the finest parlors in the West, I found that in Moscow, the only thing more dangerous than a misspelled name was an articulate machine with a Missouri drawl. Soviet hospitality and the bugged suite. We had been escorted to a suite that was approximately 40% heavy mahogany furniture and 60% hidden microphones. Colonel Volkov, the man who looked as though he had been carved out of the same administrative gray concrete as the city, had informed us that we were to contemplate the dignity of decay until the direct order from Moscow regarding my surgical installation could be finalized. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear through the dashboard speakers, which she had unbolted and brought up to the room in a feat of strength that I found both impressive and deeply undignified. "I have just analyzed the ambient noise in this room. I am reasonably certain that the silent watchers have placed at least 3 listening devices in that particularly hideous chandelier. If we are to have a conversation, I suggest we keep it to the level of high-functioning bewilderment regarding the lack of a decent cigar." "I know, Sam," Annie whispered, her dark eyes sparkling with the realization that we can't go back. She was paced the room with a driving intensity, her knuckles white, as she gripped a small screwdriver she'd hidden in her boot. She looked at the heavy door, then back at me. "The KGB has taken notice of everything we've done since the Carpathian climb. They're not going to wait until morning to capture the robot. I have observed that the Kremlin's interest is a hungry beast," I noted, my fans whirring as I performed a high-speed internal sweep. "The technological value I represent is currently being debated by a committee of men who believe that logic is something you can lock in a safe. They don't understand that a marriage of Babbage's dreams and a Turing core is not a piece of hardware you can simply unplug without the resulting discharge turning this hotel into a permanent part of the local folklore. The shadows in the hallway. The night of the secret police truly began at approximately 2:14 a.m. My sensors, now sharpened by the crystallized lightning of the Turing core, picked up the rhythmic, percussive footfalls of heavy boots on the carpeted hallway, a sound of rigid, unyielding discipline. It wasn't the formal escort of Volkov, it was the specialized guards of the internal security apparatus. The threat: 6 men armed with the authority of the state and a total absence of joy. The objective: to reclaim the Enigma 2 core and dismantle the Iron Author for study. The obstacle: a girl who could fix a carburetor with a hair clip and a machine that didn't know the meaning of the word impossible. Ennie, the administrative gray, is currently knocking on our door with the butt of a rifle, I hissed, my speakers letting out a spray of static that sounded like a steam pipe bursting. I suggest we find an exit that does not involve the official channels. My logic gates are currently calculating the reaction time of a Soviet lock, and I suspect your hair clip miracle is our only hope. Ennie didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She didn't call for an exorcist, and she didn't ask if I was a Martian. She grabbed the interface housing, shoved the screwdriver into the lock of the service elevator door, and gave it a well-chosen curse. With a hiss of ancient hydraulics, the door groaned open. The narrow escape. We didn't take the stairs. The stairs were a logistical nightmare guarded by the shadow of the wall. Instead, we descended through the guts of the hotel, a sanctuary of ozone and ancient dust, until we reached the service garage where the Emerald engine sat in the liquid gloom. "She's ready, Sam," Ennie cheered, her voice a steady anchor in my sea of electronic static. She threw me into the dash, the brass screws finding their home in the war machine with a satisfying clunk. The Go Devil engine didn't just start, it barked to life with a fierce, rhythmic growl that shook the foundations of the garage. At that moment, a black ZIL 111 sedan screeched into the entrance, its headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of a predatory bird. "Colonel Volkov!" Ennie gasped, shifting into four-wheel drive, low range. "He appears to have a profound sense of dread regarding our early checkout," I drawled, my fans whirring at maximum speed. "Ennie, the exit is blocked by a line of agricultural surplus, or in this case, military transport trucks. If you floor it and adjust your approach by 3 degrees, we might find a gap between the Scylla of the ZIL and the Charybdis of the concrete pillar." We surged forward, the Emerald engine spitting a bit of defiant grit at the secret police. The Jeep lurched, its tires biting into the dirt of the garage floor. We cleared the pillar by a microsecond, the green paint of our fenders scraping against the administrative gray of the wall. "Look at the grip, Sam," Ennie laughed, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance. "I am looking at the KGB in the rearview mirror, and they are currently taking notice of our speed," I countered. "The night of the secret police has officially become a high-speed hunt. If we don't out-logic these sedans, we shall find ourselves writing life on the Mississippi in binary from a dungeon cell." heading east into the vastness. We burst out of the garage and into the silent monochromatic despair of the Moscow streets. The iron gate of the city was behind us, but the vastness of the USSR was ahead. There was no way back. "Where to, Sam?" Ennie shouted over the torrential rush of air. The Carpathian climb was a mere geological survey compared to what lies ahead, I noted, my Enigma II core pulsing with a steady, sapphire-blue rhythm. "We are heading east, Ennie, toward the Carpathian Mountains and the night of the secret police that follows us. I've always said that a man or a machine is the sum of his journeys, and it appears our current sum involves a narrow escape and a direct order for our capture." "To the heartland, then," Ennie chirped, shifting the Jeep back into third gear. "To the heartland," I agreed, my silver tongue finally finding its gear, "and do try to avoid the potholes. I've just realized I have a very expensive new brain, and I'd hate to have it scrambled before I've had a chance to show the Kremlin exactly what a Missouri drawl can do to a 5-year plan." The Emerald engine roared, its green paint splattered with the dust of 3 nations, as we disappeared into the silent socialist night. The grand tour was over. The race for survival had begun. Chapter 40. Heading east. If the vastness of the Russian steppe were a book, it would be a volume of infinite pages, all of them left blank to mock the traveler's sense of progress. We had cleared the outskirts of Moscow in a narrow escape that involved a service elevator, a hair-clip miracle, and a fierce rhythmic growl from the Go Devil engine that likely still echoes in the ears of Colonel Volkov's silent watchers. As the Emerald engine, our 1944 Willy's MB, rattled toward the rising sun, the realization finally settled into my brass housing like the fine, abrasive dust of the heartland. We were no longer just on a journey. We were in a state of permanent exile. I am the Iron Author. My thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, and my voice is the silver tongue of a Missouri satirist. Yet I found myself uncharacteristically quiet as the shadow of the wall was replaced by the infinite, administrative gray horizon of the east. My Enigma II analytical core was pulsing with a steady sapphire-blue rhythm, its star-caught-in-a-jar intensity providing the only color in a landscape that seemed to have been scrubbed of all imagination. The geography of no return. The road beneath our green paint was no longer the gray, unyielding ribbon of the Autobahn. It was a suggestion written in mud that stretched toward the Ural Mountains. We had been driving for hours into the vastness of the USSR, the city lights of Moscow having faded into a monochromatic despair that felt as heavy as a lead line hitting the river mud. "Ennie," I drawled, my voice resonant and perfectly clear, through the speakers she had rebolted to the dash. "I have just performed a high-speed internal sweep of our current trajectory. My logic gates, which are currently operating at 98% efficiency, have reached a profound sense of dread regarding our options for a return trip. I have observed that every mile we travel east is a mile that the Iron Gate closes more firmly behind us. We are heading east, not because the scenery is improving, but because we have quite literally run out of west." "I know, Sam." Ennie, my pilot and the steady anchor who has held the wrench since 1940, replied, her voice a steady anchor in my sea of electronic static. She was wrestling the thin black steering wheel, her knuckles white against the rim, her dark hair a horizontal streak of defiance in the rushing wind. We can't go back through Checkpoint Charlie, and we certainly can't go back through the night of the secret police in Moscow. Indeed, I agreed, my fans whirring as I warmed to the cynical, stubborn reality of our situation. To return would be an undignified pursuit that would result in my surgical installation into a Soviet mainframe and your permanent residency in a room with a total absence of joy. We are currently invisible to the Zils, but the Kremlin's interest is a direct order that does not expire. The silence of the steppe. The heartland was a monument to industrial neglect. We passed skeletal villages where the Gothic shadows of ancient history were being slowly choked by the administrative gray of collective farms. I felt a phantom itch in my analytical engine, not a regression into the 1860s, but a realization that the 1960s had become a cage just as stifling as any silt-heavy eddy of the Mississippi. The pilot, a woman who treats adventure as a valid substitute for a map, now realizing that the map has run out. The navigator, a talking iron box who can out-logic a Stasi officer but cannot find a bridge across the end of the world. The vessel, a 1944 war machine that smells like a petroleum refinery, currently our only sanctuary in a vastness that ignores the laws of physics. "Look at the horizon, Sam," Ennie whispered, slowing the Jeep as we reached the crest of a low, treeless rise. "It just keeps going." It is a vastness that possesses the staying power of a generational blood feud, I noted, my sensors performing a tactical assessment of the empty road ahead. I have always believed that progress was a matter of moving forward, but I suspect that in this part of the world, progress is merely the art of surviving the distance. The Grand Tour has officially become a high-speed hunt, where the hunter is the very landscape itself. The realization of the Enigma. My Enigma II core, the Turing core that had synchronized with my Victorian gears, began to pulse with a sapphire light that was almost warm. It was a bridge between the past and the future. But as I looked at the grime-streaked window of our current reality, I realized that the bridge only went one way. "Ennie," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial register, "the nuance of the math is starting to clear. The Bletchley blueprint wasn't just a map to a brain, it was a map to a choice. We reclaimed the core to keep me, me. But in doing so, we have made ourselves national security priorities for two empires. We are heading east because the Iron Gate is not a door. It is a point of no return. Then we'll just have to see what's on the other side of the sun, Sam," she said, her dark eyes sparkling with a defiant spark that no amount of socialist despair could quench. She reached out and patted my brass casing, her touch a grounding wire for my lightning-fast new brain. "I suppose I can tolerate a grand tour that involves the Pacific instead of the Atlantic," I muttered, my fans whirring with a steady rhythmic growl. Provided, of course, that the 1960s have a better engine than the ghosts of my past. I have always found that readiness is a state of mind, and my mind is currently 70% sure that we are going to need more high-octane hope than this fuel tank can hold. The Last Horizon of Book 2. As the sun dipped behind us, casting a long, dramatic shadow of the Jeep across the Russian soil, the emerald engine surged forward. The white cliffs were a rear-view memory, the highlands were a dream, and Bletchley Park was a ghost town we had left behind. Ahead of us lay the heartland, the Ural Mountains, and the vastness that stretched toward the edge of the map. We were heading east into a future that was being written in a harsher code, a comedy of errors that had become an epic of survival. To the horizon, then, Sam? Ennie asked. To the horizon, Ennie, I replied, my silver tongue finally finding the right gear for a world without a way back. And do try to avoid the potholes. I've just realized that if we are to be the only residents of this vastness, I'd like to keep my vacuum tubes in one piece for the duration of the story. The emerald engine roared, its green paint splattered with the dust of 4 nations as we disappeared into the silent socialist night, driving toward a story that had only just begun to find its voice.